Hey guys. This is part 8 of What If Naruto Died and the Kyuubi Took Over His Body. Hit like and subscribe if you like this one, and also please check the author in the description. Let's start.
We are paid, that's all. We are God.
Chapter 36, Tricks of the Trade Part 2, Open Field. Kush's eyes widened as he felt Lee's chakra skyrocket. The genin had always had more chakra than most of his peers, even if he was not able to use it for much, but what he felt now was several times that. Lee lowered his crossed arms, revealing that his face, all of his skin, actually had turned a dark red. His eyes had also turned completely white. It was a surprisingly fierce look for the normally friendly ninja. Then he vanished. Only his ability to sense chakra allowed him to track Lee's movements. His eyes, even enhanced as they were, couldn't keep up with the speed Lee now possessed. Knowing where Lee was and how fast he was actually moving didn't help much, however, as his body couldn't react to Lee's attacks any more than his eyes could follow them. A kick slammed into his jaw and lifted his body several feet off the ground. He could feel his jaw fracturing under the force of the blow, and the muscles in his neck straining uncomfortably. Kusha pushed even more chakra into his body, but he hit his self-imposed limit moments later. If he continued, the amount of Yuki present in the body would begin triggering overt physical changes. Lee had apparently learned his lesson from earlier in the battle, as rather than a strike that launched him even further into the air, Kusha felt another hammer blow slam him into the ground. He felt more bones cracking and fracturing, and he coughed up blood as his body spasmed. Lee paused momentarily, seemingly appearing out of thin air roughly 10 feet away. "Do you concede, Naruto-kun?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. Kusha didn't respond immediately, taking full advantage of the delay to heal the wounds he had just taken. He also diverted all the chakra present in his body into enhancing his durability and resistance to damage. He couldn't strengthen his muscles enough to keep up with Lee anyway, so it was wasted chakra at this point. His skin darkened ever so slightly as he did so, barely enough to be noticeable. Lee did not seem to catch the change, pushing himself to his feet slowly, playing to Lee's concern as he feigned pain and difficulty moving. Kusha also studied Lee. Even in the few seconds since he first activated the technique, the veritable geyser of chakra triggered by opening the inner gates had lessened noticeably. A quick estimation told him that Lee could maintain this state for a few minutes at most. Kusha allowed a small chuckle to slip out as he settled into a defensive stance. Despite all he had accomplished since he had been sealed into his current container, it seemed that his greatest weapon remained patience. And as for giving up, never. Tenten forced herself to remain alert as she circled the battlefield, her eyes sharp and watchful and a brace of kunai clutched in one hand. She had taken the time to secure the box to her back with some ninja wire. It left her other hand free and made it that much harder for Ino to take it from her. Not that there seemed to be any danger of that. Aside from a single kunai at the very beginning of the fight, Ino had not made any attacks against her. Tenten had kept her far too busy dodging kunai and explosions for her to even consider counterattacking. She had expected something when the blonde girl vanished into the depths of the pits, but so far nothing had happened. Tenten allowed herself a moment to wonder if the kunoichi in this year's graduating class were that much weaker than her own. She herself had fought tooth and nail to secure her standing as kunoichi of the year, and it had been a close thing up to the very end. She had also proven herself again and again as a vital member of Team Guy, as she was the only one equally comfortable at both close and long-range combat. She couldn't defeat Neji or Lee in taijutsu, but when she was allowed to use weapons her record was much better. If she was allowed time to prepare the battlefield or had a lot of room to maneuver, her record improved even further. Even taking her own considerable skill into account, her fight against Sakura had still been disappointing. She had taken her opponent seriously from the start, especially since she knew one of the few shortcomings of her own training on Team Guy was a lack of emphasis on Genjutsu and ninjutsu. One glance at Sakura had told her that the girl was not a taijutsu specialist, but she also knew better than to underestimate any of the clan kids. It had also been a gesture of respect, from one civilian-born kunoichi to another. She hit it well at the time, but the ease with which she took Sakura down left a sour taste in her mouth. And now Ino, a fellow kunoichi of the year, seemed to be just as weak and ineffective as Sakura had been. Hell, weaker. Sakura at least had landed that genjutsu, even if she hadn't followed up in the end. The one good thing she would say for her current opponent was that her stealth was impressive. The moment she had slipped into the darkness at the bottom of the pit, Tenten had completely lost track of her. One good skill did not make for an effective kunoichi, however. Was she really that much stronger than her peers? She shook off her musings as a flicker of motion emerged from the depth of the pit. Ino, a kunai clenched in each hand and a mask of determination on her face, was charging up the side of a spire straight towards Tenten's current position. Sighing, Tenten raised her hand to throw a brace of kunai towards her opponent when another Ino emerged, again with 2 kunai and a look of determination. Then another, and another. A small smile found its way onto Tenten's lips as she began launching kunai through the air, her hands moving with incredible speed and efficiency. Perhaps her fellow kunoichi wasn't entirely hopeless after all. The first 3 kunai passed completely through their targets, revealing those to have been mere bunshin. The illusory clones blurred and faded, their structure disrupted by the passage of the weapons. The 4th kunai struck its target in the shoulder and stayed, but Ino didn't slow down or even seem to notice the blades sticking out of her. The lack of blood revealed it to be another clone, almost certainly an Earth clone. Tenten didn't have a good read on Ino's chakra reserves, but she was fairly certain Ino was lightning aligned. Using off-alignment clones was going to eat through her reserves quickly, so Tenten estimated that there were going to be 2 or 3 solid clones at most mixed in with the standard bunshin. That would be enough to seriously threaten her without going overboard and wasting chakra. Given that, her opponent's plan was likely to harass her with the solid clones while the real Ino tried to find an opening for a sneak attack of some kind, a ninjutsu, probably ranged. With that in mind, Tenten began flinging kunai with abandon, her hands blurring as they whipped through the air then dipped back into the pouches at her side. With unerring accuracy, each image of Ino that entered her sight was struck with a single kunai, almost all of them dispelling as they were revealed to be basic clones. She also began moving from spire to avoid the Earth clones that got too close for comfort. After a minute, no more bunshin were emerging from the depths and she had whittled the field down to 3 Earth clones, all of which were methodically closing in on her. They weren't just charging blindly forward, however. They had spread out to cut off possible avenues of retreat, and were currently trying to corner her. Trying, of course, since Tenten was already faster than Ino naturally, and the Earth clones were not nearly as agile as the girl herself. Still, Tenten wasn't going to play tag for the rest of the battle. She would eliminate the threats before her then focus on tracking down the real Ino. Tenten pulled out a scroll, nicked her thumb on a kunai, and swiped the blood across the storage seal. A small burst of smoke later, and Tenten held a weapon in her hand. It was a jian, a double-edged straight sword precisely 76 centimeters in length, and weighing 1,017 grams. Her hand flexed around the worn leather grip once. This sword had been with her for years, passed down in her family for 6 generations now. She was familiar with many weapons and was best known for her skill with ranged attacks, but this sword would always be her favorite. Tenten flicked her wrist once, listening to the familiar sound of the blades slicing through the air, then charged directly at the closest clone. The clone hesitated slightly, apparently taken off guard by the sudden change in tactics, and raised its arm in an attempt to grab the sword. Tenten just smirked, not even bothering to grip the sword with both hands. The ancient blade, honed by years of careful care and sharpened by some of the best craftsmen in the elemental nations, sliced through the stone that made up the clone easily. The clone, now missing half of its hand and a good chunk of its arm, changed tactics and continued its assault, now moving forward and trying to tackle Tenten. Tenten dodged easily, another swipe of her blade lopping off the clone's leg, and turned her attention to the other 2 clones who were closing in. The clones kept their kunai at the ready rather than making an attempt to simply grab Tenten directly. Out of the corner of her eye, Tenten could see the down-earth clone clinging to the side of a spire while simultaneously punching at the rock. It took her a moment to realize that the clone was pulling material from the spire in an effort to rebuild its missing limb. Clearly Ino was a little better at Earth clones than she had thought. Most clones would have dispelled entirely after taking that much damage. On the other hand, Earth clones were the most durable type, so it wasn't that surprising. It did mean she couldn't waste too much time, or she would find herself having to fight the same clones over and over. The real Ino still had not emerged from the depths either, so Tenten was no closer to a definitive end to the fight than she had been before. Tenten charged at the 2 standing clones, her jian slicing through the air as she began to chip away at them. They were more careful about blocking than the first, and didn't let her have clean shots at their limbs, but they were still slowly losing mass. Seeing the 3rd clone back on its feet, Tenten became more aggressive, putting her superior speed to good use as she circled the clones, aiming exclusively for their legs now. She scored a solid hit on one, but failed to cut completely through the leg and could already see the earth meshing back together. Then the 3rd clone rejoined the fight. They were coordinating very well with one another, and she had to defend from their strikes for the first time since she closed to melee range. She contemplated breaking away from the clones, but she was still mostly in control of the battle and so remained to try and take the clones out permanently. Spotting an opening, she managed to lop off the arm of one clone at the elbow and a return strike removed the kunai-wielding hand of another. Then one of the clones, in a surprising but oddly effective move, threw itself onto her blade. Feeling the sword twist in her hand as it became encased in solid rock, she cursed and gripped it with both hands. Mindful of the clones behind her, rather than attempting to simply pull the blade out, she wrenched it to the side, putting her muscles to good use as the sharp blade began to slice through the solid rock from a dead stop. The maneuver worked, and the sword came free with a jerk that spun her slightly around. Moving with the momentum, she continued the spin and felt the sword slice through something that had been closing in from behind. Then something hot and wet splashed on her face, and she froze. Her eyes widened as she saw Ino, the real Ino, standing before her, the girl's eyes widening in disbelief as her remaining hand clutched at her bleeding throat. Tenten could feel her own mind screaming in denial. With clinical detachment, Tenten's mind began recording the scene before her, burning it with horrifying clarity into her memory. One of Ino's arms had been sliced off cleanly by the brutally sharp blade, the stump spilling blood at a horrifying rate. The tip of the blade had laid part of her shoulder open as it continued its deadly path, and Tenten noted that a bit of bone was visible within the wound. The arc continued its slightly angled path, entering Ino's throat just above the shoulder and exiting just below the jawline, cleanly severing her windpipe, jugular vein, and carotid artery. Her mind continued to scream that it wasn't real, that it couldn't be real. A bit of blonde hair, part of the girl's long ponytail, fluttered in the wind as it descended into the depths of the pit. Ino's eyes, her bright and vivid blue eyes, were already fading as the life left them. Tenten noted two small tears forming at the corners of Ino's eyes, the last tears the girl would ever shed. She slowly began to fall forwards, gravity pulling her off the side of the spire and into the depths of the pit. Tenten's mind screamed louder, and this time it penetrated the horrified haze that had filled her brain. She was standing below Ino, and she had just cut open the girl's throat. She should have been drenched in blood. Instead, she only felt that small bit that had initially splashed on her face. Also, her sword had been traveling perfectly horizontally relative to her body, not diagonally. The height difference also meant that she should have cut through at mid-torso level, not throat level. Her eyes widened as she realized what was happening, but by then it was too late. Stands, Tenten Higurashi has been disabled, Hate announced. Ino Yamanaka may now enter another section of the arena. That was most unyouthful, Guy observed, a slightly disturbed expression on his face. One should not deceive comrades in such a manner. Ino isn't the one waving around the Higurashi Jien, Kakashi replied mildly. If Ino had been foolish enough to actually try to close to melee range after trapping the sword, that could have all too easily been real. Guy frowned, but made no reply. With the benefit of being able to observe both Genin's viewpoints, the crowd, those who had been paying attention to that particular battle, at least, had known that Ino herself had not been struck by Tenten's blade. There had still been a few screams of horror at the image shown from Tenten's shield despite that. Kakashi smiled then, turning to face Guy fully. I believe that's one of my genin with a wind locked in, he mused. And Neji isn't looking so hot at the moment. But Lee-kun is winning his match with Naruto-kun handily. Truly, a most impressive display of the flames of youth. Neji-kun is adapting to Hinata's youthful innovation admirably as well, and he has not revealed the full extent of his abilities either. The 8 trigrams, eh? Kakashi said, not sounding at all disturbed. I don't see him getting a chance to use that particular move. That aside, Lee may be winning, but Naruto isn't exactly losing. With Ino's win, I'd say the odds are about to shift in my favor. Stands, Ino has spent entirely too much time around Naruto, Sakura observed, her face pale and her voice strained. That was far too detailed and realistic, she added with a small shiver. Seeing her best friend like that, with the blood and the exposed flesh and the bits of bone, she shivered again. She'd be having nightmares about that, she was sure. Still, the more professional, objective part of her mind couldn't help but applaud Ino's skilled use of the basic bunshin. Sadly, far too many ninja didn't even consider that the bunshin could look like something other than an exact replica of its creator. That was merely the simplest version to use, and the only one required by the academy. The real touch had been the liquid she had apparently buried deep within one of the clones. Sakura wasn't sure how she had stored it in the clone or gotten it to release at the right time, but judging by the small bandage on Ino's arm, that had been real blood, which likely made the situation that much more realistic for Tenten. Forest, Neji and Hinata both paused when the barrier separating them from the pit section of the arena faded out of view. The sudden removal of the wall blocking their sight was disorienting, but it was the meaning behind the absence of the wall that gave them pause. Their battle had continued for some time with only small shifts in the advantage to one or the other. The overall flow of their contest had begun to tilt in Hinata's favor, but it was still close enough that Neji could easily triumph should an opening present itself. However, with the addition of a third person to the fight, the end would likely come soon. Neji's eyes widened slightly when he noticed Ino hopping out of the pit and onto the solid ground of the forest. He had not expected Tenten to be defeated. This also meant that he would be in a great deal of trouble very soon as Ino coordinated her attacks with Hinata. His cousin was surprisingly difficult to handle already. It was unlikely he would last very long against the both of them. Acting quickly, he broke away from his match with Hinata, pushing his legs as hard as he could as he darted through the forest, bouncing from tree to tree. His sudden, decisive movement had taken his cousin off guard, giving him precious moments to move out of her range. His running speed was also greater than Hinata's. Team Guy as a whole was in superior physical condition thanks to their intense training regimen. He heard Hinata shouting, warning Ino of his approach, but he was already darting out of the trees and closing with her, his hands poised to disable his new opponent. If he could take her out before Hinata caught up with him, he could even the odds once more and possibly salvage the battle. Ino's eyes widened in shock as he came blazing out of the forest, her arms raising instinctively in a defensive gesture. She was well trained, he noted, as her hastily adopted stance was solid. Compared to Lee, however, her stance might as well have left her wide open. His hands shot forward, first two fingers extended, as he began methodically closing Ino's tenketsu. He didn't have time to whittle down her defenses as he normally preferred, so he bypassed her arms and struck directly at her torso. Left shoulder. Left collarbone. Right collarbone. Left lung. Right lung. 5 strikes, and Ino's ability to use ninjutsu was severely lessened. It was still technically possible for her to use jutsu as there were 3 distinct paths for chakra in each arm, but with half of them shut down it would be very difficult to compensate. Her left arm began to drop as well, her motor control disrupted for the moment along with her chakra network. Left upper lateral. Right upper lateral. Left lower lateral. Taking advantage of the opening, he focused the majority of his efforts along her left side, attempting to completely shut down the chakra network there. If he could get her leg as well, that would be sufficient to remove her from the battle entirely. Hinata was closing in quickly, less than 20 feet away now. He still had time to complete his goal, however. Left stomach. Mid-stomach. Left. Ino's right arm latched onto his left, gripping tightly and pulling him closer to her. Cursing mentally at allowing his attention to lapse from the immediate threat, he struck out with his free arm. Right shoulder. Right. Even as Ino's grip slackened and her hand fell free, Hinata was upon him, her hands moving as quickly as his own. Unfortunately for him, Ino's last-ditch effort meant that he was still facing away from Hinata, and she had a clean shot at his unprotected back. He began to flare his chakra, attempting to utilize the Kaiten once more, probably for the last time, as his reserves were running low at this point. But Hinata did not back away as she had before. He felt the series of jabs signaling his defeat begin with his core tenketsu. Hinata's touch was gentle and swift as she worked her way outward in a spiral. His Kaiten died before it truly formed as the chakra required to sustain it was cut off. He collapsed to the ground, limp, the familiar numbness caused by Juken strikes washing over his body. His Byakugan faded along with his chakra, leaving him staring into the dirt beneath him. Well done, Hinata-sama, he panted. Thank you, Neji and I-san, she replied, her voice soft. Kick-ass job and all, but could you fix me? We haven't exactly won yet, Ino's voice interrupted. Hinata did not reply verbally, but he could hear her steps moving closer. Much better, Ino said after a few seconds, and he could hear her picking herself up off the ground. Gah, and now the tingling sets in. Neji felt his eyelids growing heavy, and did not fight the sensation. He had used a great deal of chakra warding off Hinata-sama's surprising variation of the Juken with repeated Kaitens, and with his own network now sealed, he was feeling the beginnings of chakra exhaustion. Just before he lost consciousness, he wondered how Lee was managing in his own battle. Open field. Kushu had disconnected himself from the body's nervous system after 10 seconds. What he felt wasn't the same as pain, nothing like what he had experienced vicariously through Ryudo, certainly, but the sensation was highly unpleasant all the same. He was also devoting most of his attention to healing the damage his body took. Despite the enhancements he had made to his body and the reinforcement from his chakra, every bone in his body had cracked at least once, and most several times. His ulna and radius in both arms, along with his tibia and fibula in both legs, had endured outright breaks several times as he attempted to block some of Lee's strikes. The green-clad genin had also taken to kicking him into the barrier, and the walls that segregated the arena might as well have been fashioned from solid steel for all the give they had. One of those hits had fractured 4 vertebrae. He hadn't gotten a good look at himself since the onslaught began, but judging by the splotches of blood on Lee's jumpsuit, he had also been bleeding on occasion as well. He didn't let the true extent of his injuries show, of course. He was fairly certain even Lee didn't know just how much damage he was doing. Either that, or the boy had a very well-hidden vicious streak in him. Any other opponent would have died by this point. Then again, any other opponent would have been incapable of standing long before now, either because they lost consciousness or were injured severely enough to prevent movement. Kushu was actually surprised the announcer had not called the match in Lee's favor. He was still standing, true, but he was purely on the defensive. He hadn't even attempted a single counterattack in the last 3 minutes. Then again, Lee had yet to take advantage of the few times he had been slow to stand back up to hold a kunai to his throat for a few seconds. Even if such a threat would not work against him in reality, it would be more than sufficient for the Chunin exams, since the gesture served as a common sign that one opponent had killed the other. Instead, Lee seemed to be trying to literally beat him into submission. Apparently the boy wanted him to either lose consciousness or verbally admit defeat. There was also the possibility that the thought of using a kunai never even crossed his mind. Lee launched him into the air again, and with another spinning kick to the side sent him rocketing towards the nearby barrier, which disappeared as he approached, revealing the forest section of the arena. Without the wall providing a hard stop, his momentum carried him deep into the forest. His back impacted against one of the trees instead, shattering the wood. He hung there a moment, suspended against the side of the tree, before sliding downward to land in a heap at the bottom. His bones snapped into place with a dull crackle as his yuki pulled them into position. Damage healed once more, he prepared himself to take yet more blows. It took him a moment to realize that Lee was not following up on his most recent attack. Cocking his head slightly, he finally realized that he could sense his teammates along with Neji and Tenten. The fact that Ino and Hinata were standing together near the open field while Neji was lying at the edge of the forest and Tenten was at the bottom of the pit indicated that his teammates had won their respective fights. Unfortunately, Lee's technique had not yet faded entirely. He had lost some steam, but he still had more than enough energy left to take out both Hinata and Ino before returning his attention to his original opponent. However, at the moment he was standing still, probably talking to Hinata and Ino. Moving quickly, Kusha slipped underground using the earth style, mole imitation technique and rapidly made his way towards Lee. If the genin would stand still for just a few seconds longer, "You have defeated my teammates, it seems," Lee said solemnly. "A most youthful feat, but now it falls to me to carry onward." "I will." He was interrupted as 2 hands burst out of the ground beneath him and pulled him downward abruptly. Kusha popped out of the ground as quickly as Lee submerged, and he immediately slapped his hands onto the earth next to Lee. His opponent was almost completely underground at this point, only his head sticking out. "Ino!" Kusha snapped. "Take him out now!" His hands were glowing a light purple as he pumped obscene amounts of chakra into his earth-style, hardened jutsu. He could actually feel the earth shuddering underneath him as Lee tried to wrench himself free. Ino jumped slightly, startled by his sudden appearance, but quickly began blurring through hand seals. Lee's eyes widened as he realized what was about to happen. The earth trembled again as Lee's head whipped back and forth, but Kusha's jutsu held. "Gate of Pain," really Lee began, but Ino completed her jutsu before he could activate his next technique. Lee's head lolled forward slightly before it snapped upright. "Holy shit," he said. "Hinata! Seal his tenketsu, right now!" Hinata leaped forward even as Kusha pulled Lee out of the ground. He had been prepared to use a kunai to the throat to kill the genin, but trusted Ino's assessment that the situation wasn't as secure as he thought. Hinata's hands blurred as she landed strike after strike. She might have aimed at the tenketsu in Lee's head, which could possibly have taken him out in one strike, but a single mistake in her aim or the amount of chakra she applied could seriously damage or even kill him instead of merely rendering him unconscious. She had been trained to aim above the neck only when she intended to kill her opponent. "Losing him!" Lee shouted a second later, then his head sagged forward. Hinata tried to move faster, but Lee's leg shot forward, catching her in the stomach and flinging her backwards. He staggered after delivering the blow, moving without his normal grace or speed. Kusha could sense the chakra within Lee's body quickly fading back to normal levels, then even lower. The genin didn't seem to care though, as he forced his body to settle into a stance once again. "My flames of youth will not be dimmed," he proclaimed, panting harshly. Gate of pain, release. Kushu tensed, but slowly relaxed when nothing happened. Lee looked confused for a moment, then his eyes rolled into the back of his head and he collapsed. Kage box. Team Kakashi has won the match, and what a match it was! Hate announced. Both teams made an absolutely incredible showing. The crowd roared its approval, the sound of their shouting and cheering shaking the stadium. Most impressive, Hokage Dano, the Kazekage said. You must be quite proud. Oh, I am, the Hokage replied easily, chuckling. It does this old man good to know that such promising ninja have inherited the will of fire. They also made quite an impression on the crowd, the Kazekage observed. It will make my own genin look that much better when they win tomorrow, he added. The Hokage smirked, turning to face the Kazekage fully. I wouldn't count on that, Konoha, Anko grumbled to herself as she continued her patrol while listening to the distant roar coming from the stadium. The noise level had been steadily increasing for the last 10 minutes, and she just knew she was missing out on a great show. If she remembered correctly, it was Team Guy against Team Kakashi, and both teams were considered to be among the strongest Konoha had seen in years. There was also no telling what Guy and Kakashi had managed to teach their kids. Both of the jounin knew each other quite well, as they had been friends for decades and worked together often. No doubt their students were prepared to counter the other specialties, which meant they'd have to get creative in order to win. Anko cursed again and forced herself to think about something else, like the fact that she had found fuck all in the way of infiltrators. Her team hadn't even found normal criminals in her latest sweep. She knew better than to think there were no infiltrators to find, however. The Hokage clearly trusted his source of information. Her bastard of a teacher had also trained her to expect the worst, and, despite her deep and utter loathing of the man and his actions, she acknowledged that he knew what he was talking about when it came to life as a ninja. There were infiltrators, probably quite a few of them, and they were good enough to avoid patrols that were actively looking for them. Hokage's office. -8:00 p.m. Still nothing? Sarutobi asked wearily. Unfortunately, no, Hokage-sama. We'll need to increase the patrols sweeping the village tomorrow then. Who do we have available? Troublesome, Shikaku replied. All available shinobi are already assigned, Hokage-sama, with the majority focused on security in and immediately around the stadium since the majority of the known targets will be gathered there. We've even drafted the jounin instructors and other ninja on long-term internal missions to provide additional coverage. The Hokage sat back, puffing on his pipe thoughtfully. Slowly, a grim smile spread across his face. We haven't pulled in everyone, he said. I think it's time to see just how much use we can get out of our newest ally. Do we still have a team assigned to protect Naruto from the potential kidnapping attempt? Shikaku nodded, his mind working rapidly. Yes, a full ANBU squad. He blinked then sighed. Troublesome. The Hokage pressed a small seal on his desk, and an ANBU entered the room a moment later. Please bring me Naruto Yamanaka. Pardon, Hokage-sama, but is he not sequestered until tomorrow's battle? Do it discreetly, the Hokage replied simply. This is more important than the exam regulations. Of course, Hokage-sama, the ANBU quickly replied. Once the ANBU had left, Sarutobi created a shadow clone then turned to Shikaku. Are you going to participate this time? Shikaku nodded, creating a single clone of his own. It will help to directly observe his attitude and responses, he remarked. Very well. We still have other matters to deal with, so let us put our time to good use. The two ninja left, leaving their clones behind to handle the meeting with their newest and least trusted ally. Chapter 37, Unwelcome Reunions. August 1st, 347 NE. Hokage's office. -9:00 p.m. Shikaku watched as Naruto sat down in a chair across from the Hokage. As the three of them waited for the ANBU to leave the room so they could activate the privacy seals and begin their discussion, he tried to find some sign he might have missed that would have tipped him off as to Naruto's true identity, some mannerism that wasn't quite human. He couldn't find one. All he saw was Naruto, the boy who could hold his own against his son in shogi, the boy Inoichi was so proud of, the boy who was known as Konoha's little hero, the boy who apparently never existed at all. This must be rather important if you are willing to break Chunin exam protocol just to meet with me, Naruto said. The Hokage leaned forward, placing his elbows on the desk and clasping his hands together in front of his mouth. Shikaku was sitting off to the side of the desk in another chair. He was currently leaning back lazily, but his gaze was sharp. I thought we all might benefit if we arranged a trial mission of sorts, Sarutobi said. Something to get us used to the idea of working together with one another. Something to build trust, if you like. Shikaku noted the change in the Hokage's tone. He had seen the two of them interact before they realized what Naruto really was, and this was markedly different. The Hokage's tone was colder, more guarded, and his posture was calculating. Given the timing, I assume this has something to do with tomorrow's battle? Naruto asked drily. In a way. You were the one who informed us that Gaara was being targeted for assassination during the Chunin exams. But you may not be aware that we have uncovered several other plots all taking place within the same time frame. Naruto raised one eyebrow, but didn't reply. One of those was a kidnapping plot, with yourself as the target. Naruto chuckled lowly. That would be amusing, interesting. That response was far more dismissive than he would have expected of Naruto. It seemed the Bijou was letting his true personality slip through a little bit more, or perhaps he didn't feel the need to maintain his act as thoroughly. I imagine from your perspective it would be, the Hokage admitted. We received this information shortly after I uncovered your true identity. At the time we assigned a full ANBU squad to guard you for the duration of the exams as a precaution and to maintain your cover. However, we now have a pressing need for that squad elsewhere, and, well, I don't think you really need the protection, do you? Naruto grinned, a vicious, eager grin that seemed disturbingly suited to his face. It emphasized the marks on his cheeks and made his eyes seem even more animalistic. Shikaka had seen that expression on occasion, but it took on an entirely different connotation in this situation. The grin faded as quickly as it came, leaving a bored expression in its wake. If that was all, you wouldn't need to inform me personally, or at all, for that matter. So, what is this mission you have in mind? Shikaka decided to jump in at this point. He had a theory that he wanted to test, and this was the perfect time. You were not the only target, he said lazily. The plots seem to be focused on bloodlines, and we have several specific names, he added. He studied Naruto's face intensely as he listed off the known targets. Sasuke Uchiha, Katsune Uchiha, Satomi Uchiha, a hint of amusement, Hinata Hyuga, Hanabi Hyuga, a tinge of annoyance, Ino Yamanaka. Naruto's nostrils flared and his pupils dilated. His entire body stiffened subtly, and his hands clenched slightly. The reaction was controlled swiftly as Naruto's entire body relaxed slightly before resuming its previous position a moment later. If he hadn't been watching for it, he might have missed it entirely. Well, there was some support for his theory, though it was hardly proof and raised more questions than it answered. Shikaka noticed the Hokage's eyes darting towards his own, an obvious question in them. Shikaka shook his head slightly, telling the Hokage not to comment on the extra name in the list. With yourself included, they seem to be targeting every active genin with a bloodline that does not require an extensive support network to function properly. The Aburame, for instance, would be virtually impossible to recreate elsewhere. Other clans, such as the Kurama, are lower profile but are still considered at risk even though we don't have information suggesting they are being targeted specifically, Shikaka continued smoothly. And with so many potential targets, the Hokage said, taking control of the explanation once more, Konoha's available forces have been spread thin. You, on the other hand, have the power and skill to not only protect yourself but your teammates as well. Should the attempts actually happen, your mission is to escort your teammates, along with anyone else you come across that is at risk, to Emergency Shelter 12 located near the Shinobi District. Once you have done that, you are to patrol the surrounding area and dispatch any hostile elements you encounter. This mission will preempt any orders you may receive in the field unless they come from either myself or Shikaku. Naruto cocked his head to the side thoughtfully. This is not a mission you would normally assign to a genin, or even a chunin, he said after a moment. It is not, the Hokage agreed, but you are far from a normal genin. Very true, Naruto said, that vicious smile on his face again, but that was not my point. You are asking far more of me than usual. Why should I accept this mission? Do you not wish to protect your investment? Shikaku asked idly, carefully observing Naruto's expression. You have spent a great deal of time bringing them closer to your own level of skill and power, after all. I'm sure you wouldn't want all that time and effort to go to waste. There was no overt reaction this time, and you would let them be carted off to some other village should I not take this mission? Naruto asked, his voice mocking. I think not. This isn't about their protection, but guarding other people or locations in the village. As primary targets, they will be secured regardless. What did you have in mind in the way of compensation, then? The Hokage asked mildly. The answer to my question, Naruto said. The Hokage frowned. Which question was that? How were the summons able to tell you what they did? Interesting, very interesting. The Hokage had mentioned that the Bija had seemed rather curious about that point before, but to bring it up now, and as the price for his cooperation? There must be something important they were overlooking in that matter. The Hokage leaned back in his chair, looking pensive. Shikaku himself didn't have a summoning contract, but he knew that the Hokage and Jiraiya-sama greatly valued their own relationships with the summons. This couldn't be an easy decision for him to make. Only if you also reveal the information you have about this Akatsuki group that you claimed first sealed your brethren, the Hokage countered after a minute of silent contemplation. If they are once again active as you say, their goals would likely disrupt the balance in the elemental nations considerably. Very well, Naruto answered after a moment. The Hokage sighed, rubbing his hand across his face. The Toads informed Jiraiya of the existence of other realms when they made their offer to him to become a full member of the Toad tribe. Naruto's brow furrowed. A full, then that would mean, he trailed off, then his face went completely blank. Shikaku startled slightly, recognizing an old mannerism of Naruto's that they had attributed to his imitation of A and BU ninja. It had gradually stopped happening after he was adopted into the Yamanaka household, something they had taken as a sign of progress. Seeing it now made him realize that the actual cause was entirely different than what they had thought. His expression came back suddenly, morphing into a sadistic leer. Some small, irrational part of Shikaku had held out hope, if only for the sake of Inoichi and his family, that this entire situation was just a terrible misunderstanding. But seeing the malevolent contempt in the Biju's face shattered that hope to pieces. There was nothing left of Naruto in that expression. Oh, those clever little insects, the Biju said. It seems we didn't give them enough credit, he chuckled darkly, but said nothing further. Shikaku couldn't help but feel that the Hokage may have just made a mistake in revealing that information, that he had no idea what Kushu had just figured out, and the implications it may have worried him even further. The Hokage shared his misgivings, judging by the pained expression on his face. On the other hand, it was inevitable that Jiraiya-sama's situation would become known among the shinobi forces at some point, and there was no way they could stop the Biju from learning of it then. The details of the situation would have come out regardless, so perhaps it was for the best that they got something useful out of Kushu prior to that happened. And your information? Akatsuki crafted the initial seals which held myself and my brethren, and began their attacks by targeting what they believed to be the weakest of us, the One Tail. They are either the source or perpetuated the idea that the Biju are ranked in power according to the number of tails, it seems. Their goal appears to have been to harness our power for themselves in an attempt to conquer the elemental nations. Their initial attempt sealed the One Tail into a ceremonial urn, apparently merely to get him out of the way while they dealt with the other Biju. The other Biju were sealed into people, first adults and later children. Judging by the information I have seen, they were refining their methods and experimenting with different approaches with each sealing. I am still unclear as to how Akatsuki did it, but they are also the source of the all-consuming seal of the god of death. Their former leader apparently went to great lengths in order to acquire that seal, but the details as to how are missing. Regardless, the information I have is incomplete and ends entirely a few days before they had planned to attack me. I think you know the rest of the story from there. The Hokage nodded, his expression thoughtful. Do you have information as to their current members or how they can be identified? As for current members, no, but they do have a uniform of sorts, black cloaks with red clouds. August 2nd, 347 NE, Konoha Stadium, -10:00 AM. Orochimaru watched through Jirobo's eyes as the Konoha team prepared to fight the Suna team. Suna's Jinchuriki was facing off against the surprisingly powerful Yamanaka boy in the open field while the puppeteer faced the Hyuga in the forest, and the fan user faced the Yamanaka girl in the open pit. The crowd, primed by yesterday's impressive match between the Konoha teams, were cheering more loudly than ever as the proctor announced the start of the match. Orochimaru signaled to his subordinates, and began slowly making his way out of the stadium. He noted that the team assigned to watch their movements was unusually attentive and began following their progress immediately, suspicious looks painted on their faces. He also caught the second, much more skilled, team following at a more discreet distance. It seemed Konoha wasn't entirely complacent about the potential risk his team posed. The Konoha ninja followed them all the way back to their assigned hotel, a mistake which sealed their fate. If they had confronted them near the stadium, perhaps his plan might have been delayed or inconvenienced, but the moment he entered his hotel room there was no chance of anyone stopping him. The door closed behind them and the privacy seals flared to life. His subordinates pulled out 3 small metal rods from various packs. Each rod was inscribed with an intricate series of designs and covered with several tags. Orochimaru stepped into the middle of the room, pausing as he began seeking out the chakra battery teams scattered outside of Konoha. There were 3 total, 1 for each of the ninja he would be summoning. It took him nearly 2 minutes to locate them all and weave the chakra threads they were producing together with the thread already in place. Once he had, though, he could feel the massive amounts of chakra pouring into Jirobo's body. The combined chakra of nearly a dozen ninja with solid A-rank reserves further boosted by chakra pills would normally be enough to last any ninja weeks with careful use. He expected to completely drain them within the hour. He could have potentially brought more, but he didn't want to commit too many resources to the attack. Damaging Konoha, while tangentially beneficial to his goals, was not his true purpose. He needed to provide a distraction to allow his subordinates and the mercenaries the Eastern Dragons had hired time to work, nothing more. He evaluated Kidameru, Sakan, and Yukon's skill levels high enough that they should be able to accomplish their assigned tasks and leave Konoha in that time frame. The chakra teams should be at minimal risk, but even if they were lost it would not hinder him in any way, other than their reserves. They possessed no particular skills or knowledge worth keeping. And of course, there was absolutely no risk to himself at all. Finally prepared, his hands blurred through a short string of hand signs and he intoned, summoning, impure world resurrection. The bodies themselves had been prepared many weeks ago, and he had practiced controlling them numerous times in preparation for this day. Nonetheless, he had to perform the technique again each time he wanted to actually bring the bodies forth, and they constantly drained chakra until the technique was deactivated and the resurrected ninja dismissed. Maintaining Jirobo for so long had strained him, and that was without using any techniques at all. He had learned a great deal from the experience, however, and once he had time to review what he had learned he would likely be able to increase his efficiency with the impure world resurrection technique even further. The tags began to lift off the ground as ashes formed out of thin air around them. The ash began to morph into bones, and then organs formed, followed by skin and then clothing. After a few seconds 3 more men stood in the room. The first looked young, with long black hair hanging straight down his back and wearing red armor over black garb. The second wore blue armor in the same style as the first, with the addition of a fur collar and a face guard. His gray hair lent him an older appearance, though his face was every bit as young as that of the first man. The third man had spiky blonde hair and wore a white cloak with stylized red flames along the bottom edge over a traditional Konoha jounin uniform. "So that's him, huh?" Kidameru said, poking the blonde man in the face. "He doesn't look like much, really." The blonde turned to face him. "Ah, to be so young and foolish," he said. "Enough talk. You know your jobs, get ready to do them." "Yes, Orochimaru-sama." The blonde turned suddenly, swinging his fist at the red-clad man. The blue-clad one intercepted his fist, while the red-clad one attacked. The 3 men blurred into a quick exchange of blows, each seemingly attacking one of the others at random. After a few seconds each stopped and turned to face the outer wall of the hotel room. "No problems," Jirobo said, still standing in the middle of the room. "And with that, we can begin." The red-clad man raised his hands and flashed through a short string of hand seals. "Wood release, wild growth," he called out. The wood that formed the walls began to twist and warp, rapidly expanding upwards and outwards. The surrounding walls shuddered and broke under the sudden strain, before they too began to grow. Under the cover of the sudden destruction, Kidameru and Sakan slipped out to begin their own missions. Jirobo dropped through the bottom of the floor, slipping underground without leaving a single sign of his passage. His body served as the anchor for the 3 resurrected men, and he would not be fighting directly for as long as Orochimaru could manage. The blonde man also disappeared, racing towards a certain neglected compound in the shinobi residential district. Unlike the other 2, his most powerful technique required tools to work properly, tools which were not recreated along with his body. Orochimaru had also been unable to acquire working copies of his specially crafted kunai outside of Konoha, much to his dismay. He knew of several potential sources within Konoha, however, and was prepared to check each and every one, starting with the man's former home. The limits of the impure world resurrection technique also meant that he could not learn the secrets of the technique from the 4th Hokage directly. The resurrected were pale shadows of themselves, more a collection of instincts and reflexes than actual copies of the deceased. They did not speak unless the summoner did so through them, nor could they communicate in any other fashion. Even ordering the Hokage to prepare a Hiraishin kunai produced nothing useful. The resurrected were meant for battle, nothing more. Orochimaru knew that his plan was already guaranteed to damage Konoha greatly, but if he could reunite the 4th Hokage with a working Hiraishin kunai, Konoha Stadium, 10:15 a.m. The moment the Hokage felt the massive flare of chakra in the middle of Konoha, he signaled his ANBU and set his own response into motion. ANBU teams began escorting the fire and wind lords to their assigned emergency shelters, while other ninja began securing the lesser nobles and wealthy patrons, leading them to other shelters. The ninja scattered among the crowd moved rapidly to their assigned positions around the entrances and perimeter of the stadium, securing all the access points and making sure that no enemy ninja slipped into the stadium to attack the densely packed civilians. Other ninja moved to secure the potential targets of this attack. The Hokage and his advisors had decided early on that the targets would be kept together as much as possible. Hayashi Hyuga had volunteered to be in charge of that group, as both of his daughters were among those at risk. Hanabi was already placed in Emergency Shelter 12, accompanied by her mother and several branch house ninja. Hayashi would be sweeping the stadium and village for any other potential targets, and escorting them to Emergency Shelter 12. The presence of the Byakugan also meant that those within the shelter would have ample warning should enemy forces manage to locate them, which was why at least one Hyuga was assigned to every emergency shelter in use. Once all the high-priority targets, other than those involved in the last round of the Chunin exams, were well on their way to their assigned shelters, Hate appeared in the middle of the arena once again. The moment he did so, the screens flickered for a moment before displaying an odd array of mixed images and swirling colors. At the base of each screen stood a kurama ninja, their brows laced in concentration as they focused on their assigned task. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out calmly, "please follow the Konoha ninja in your section calmly and quietly. They will escort you to where you need to go. Please follow their instructions as quickly and efficiently as possible. You will be safe with them. Please follow the Konoha ninja in your section calmly and quietly. They will." The crowd, easily snared by the Genjutsu suggestions being fed into their minds, turned to the ninja closest to them, awaiting instructions. They would be escorted, one group at a time, out of the stadium and to their assigned shelters. The ninja escorting each group would make the call to determine whether the most direct route was safe enough to employ. Most of Konoha had gathered to watch the final match of the Chunin exams, which meant that if the ninja successfully repelled any potential attacks on the stadium, that most of Konoha would be protected. The stadium was a horrible defensive position, however, only made tenable by the sheer number of ninja protecting it. The likelihood of preventing all possible attacks was very low. The more of the crowd they could move to the shelters, which a handful of prepared ninja could hold for days if need be, the better off everyone would be. Every group that reached their assigned shelter also meant another group of ninja that could deal with the actual threat rather than protecting non-combatants. "Most impressive, Hokage Dano," the Kazekage said as he watched the meticulously coordinated efforts of the Konoha forces. "It seems that you have everything well in hand. I will attend to the Wind Lord and leave you to deal with these upstarts." "Of course, Kazekage Dano," the Hokage replied, watching his counterpart carefully. He only relaxed once the man had left the room and was well on his way to the proper shelter. He had almost expected to be attacked at any moment, but it seemed the Kazekage was playing a subtler game. Regardless, now that the Kazekage had removed himself from the field, he could focus his attention on other matters. He moved quickly to the top of the stadium, staring out over Konoha as he tried to identify the source of the attack. It didn't take him long at all, as a massive forest had sprung up in the middle of the commercial district. He only knew of two men who could possibly do that, and one of them was currently standing on top of the stadium nearby. The other was dead. "That's impossible," he muttered to himself. Then his face darkened as he recalled a forbidden jutsu that made such a thing not only possible, but likely. If that were the case, however, this situation could be far worse than they had anticipated. "Dragon?" the Hokage snapped, turning to the ANBU commander who stood nearby. "Alert all of our forces that the enemy is using the Impure World Resurrection technique. They have summoned a crude imitation of the showdown, and will be able to use any techniques he used in life. There are two ways to counter the technique. The first, and likely easier given who was summoned, is to kill the summoner. The summoner should be within a few hundred feet of the showdown's imitation, so have all available Hyuga scan for him carefully. The other option is to disable the imitation directly. Somewhere within his body will be an anchoring tag. If the tag is destroyed, the jutsu will end. Have the Akimichi and Inuzuka focus on engaging the showdown directly if possible. Their techniques should damage the body enough to expose or even break the tag. Also, have any available Aburames saturate the area with their Kakaichu. The imitation has to be supplied with chakra from an external source, so they may be able to locate the summoner that way." "Yes, Hokage-sama," Dragon said quickly. "Have all forces coordinate with Shikaku from this point on. He will be located near the Hokage Tower." "Yes, Hokage-sama. If I may ask, where will you be? Who better to counter a Hokage than another Hokage?" "Outside the stadium. 10:20 a.m. It was rather fortunate that the method he was using to enter Konoha undetected suppressed all chakra in his body, or he may have gotten caught in the genjutsu used to keep the crowd under control, Itachi mused. He patiently followed along with the crowd being escorted by Konoha ninja, waiting for an opportunity to slip away unnoticed. He found it a minute later as the crowd passed by a dark alley. The ninja escorting them were more concerned with external threats than making sure that the enthralled civilians didn't separate from the group, so it was a very simple task. Now that he was able to move about the village, he carefully avoided both the ever-expanding battle in the center of the village and the ninja leaping overhead. A few minutes later he reached his destination, the Konoha Records Department. A quick glance inside confirmed his suspicions, as he noted the shattered, blood-covered walls and the bodies of the ninja assigned to guard the records department. He had suspected from the moment he heard of the impending attack that someone would go after Konoha's most sensitive documents. The knowledge contained within, in terms of both ninja techniques and more mundane information, was bound to interest a great many people. Once again, his instincts had not failed him. Whoever had planned this assault had predicted Konoha's reaction well. The Hokage had left everything but the outer walls and the stadium manned by a skeleton crew. With so many potential targets, especially in terms of foreign dignitaries and nobles, Konoha simply did not have enough ninja on hand to cover everything. The Hokage had prioritized what they felt were the most likely or risky targets, and trusted to their static defenses to stop or at least delay other avenues of attack. Fortunately for Itachi, the static defenses were not sufficient in this case. He settled into a convenient shadow, expertly concealing his presence, and slipped the bracelet off of his wrist. He may have declined the job to assassinate Gaara, but that didn't mean he was going to let this opportunity go to waste. A few minutes later his patience was rewarded as two ninja, one wearing a Konoha headband and the other wearing an Oto headband, quickly exited the building and began moving rapidly towards Konoha's walls. He recognized the black-haired Otonin as the one who had battled Temari in the first bout yesterday. Kidamaru, he believed his name was. The Konohanin had gray hair yet looked to be in his mid-20s. Itachi couldn't recall ever encountering the ninja before, and he did not have any distinctive markings or physical traits that would identify as belonging to one of Konoha's clans. Itachi followed behind the fleeing ninja, biding his time until they were outside the walls of Konoha and his chakra had recovered sufficiently to engage in a battle against the two of them. Arena. -10:20 AM. And that would be our signal, Kusha said. Gaara lowered his hands, allowing his clones to collapse. Very well. The barriers dividing the arena a moment later lowered, and their teammates entered the open field a moment later. This entire exam has been annoying, Kankuro said. First the Odo team doesn't take it seriously, then we have to fake the fight for this round. Can't believe I had to wait 3 years for this, complained later, Temari growled. We've got bigger things to worry about, Kusha nodded. We are supposed to head towards emergency shelter 12, so let's get moving, he said, sounding impatient. The others nodded silently, and followed him as he navigated through the bowels of the arena towards one of the exits. This specific exit was guarded by an ANBU who knew of the Hokage's assignment, and so merely confirmed that no hostile forces were present, and waved them through quickly. Emergency Shelter 12 was located near the Shinobi District, and was thus nearly a mile away from their current location. Their path did not come close to the heart of the battle, however. The two teams made their way quickly and silently across the village, noting the deserted streets and sounds of distant battle. The sheer amount of chakra they could sense being thrown about was astonishing, as it was far more than most of them had ever felt before. The glimpses they could detect of the giant forest that had apparently sprung up in the middle of Konoha also served to confuse and astound them. Kusha felt the chakra signature moving closer, but paid it little mind at first. It wasn't until it stopped on a nearby rooftop and began gathering chakra for a technique that he actively paid attention to it. His head turned to note the disguised figure currently flashing through hand seals. The figure was garbed entirely in black, every inch of the ninja's body covered except for the eyes. The figure appeared male, although it was difficult to say for sure. Lightning release, Lance of Heaven, the figure declared in a muffled voice a moment later, thrusting their hands forward. Kusha could feel the chakra gathering at a rapid pace, all of it aimed at himself and his teammates, and reacted swiftly. A strong wind style burst through his teammates, and the Suna team away from the center of the blast while simultaneously dampening the effect of the lightning jutsu. Then the world turned white. That was far and away the most damage his body had ever taken, he noted idly. His eyes were blinded and the skin over half of his body was charred and blackened. He also couldn't hear anything at all through the body, as his eardrums had burst. The worst damage was internal, however, as the nerves throughout most of his body were completely fried. His own senses still worked fine, however, and he could feel the other genin reacting swiftly to the attack as they covered each other while not allowing the attacker time to get off another jutsu of that caliber. He focused on healing his sight and hearing first, as well as mending the damage to the nerves. Soon he could make out Ino's furious shouting as she threatened all manner of bodily harm to their assailant. She paused in her verbal assault, however, as the assailant spoke. "I only want the redhead," the muffled voice said, "so unless you want to end up like that blonde over there, I'd suggest you leave now." There was a bit of tension in the voice, however, and Kusha could feel Temari's chakra in particular flaring wildly as she hurled a series of strong wind jutsu at their attacker. It would appear that the would-be assassin had expected to do a lot more damage with that initial attack and wasn't quite prepared to deal with so many enemies at once. Gaara-san was also moving quickly, constantly threatening the disguised ninja and forcing them to dodge repeatedly. Judging by their words, the attacker had dismissed him as a threat. Grinning to himself, he made a bunshin in his place, making sure it reflected the level of damage he had initially taken, and slipped underground. He continued to heal the damage he had taken while he observed the battle taking place overhead, maneuvering into position. He had to let the bunshin dissolve as he moved too far away to maintain it, but by that point he was well hidden. A series of sand spikes from Gaara had the attacker leaping into the air, at which point Temari's wind blades slammed into him. The attacker appeared to have some sort of defensive technique as the jutsu did not slice him apart, but he was still hurled backwards to slam into a nearby building. Kankuro's puppet was the hardest to track for Kushu as there was very little chakra in it, but judging by the way the enemy rapidly rolled away he had likely launched some sort of attack of his own. Ino, meanwhile, was putting her training with Kakashi to good use, swiftly countering any of the quick but weak techniques the enemy managed to get off. Small lances of lightning-natured chakra, far slower and weaker than actual lightning, were diverted by grounded arcs of electricity, and waves of sparking motes of light were pulled together and extinguished by charged kunai. Hinata, who didn't dare close to melee range with all the jutsu flying about and didn't have any water at hand to use her own jutsu, was standing back from the battle and presumably watching for any other attackers. Then the assailant dodged close enough to his current position, and Kushu was in motion. He popped out of the ground a short distance behind the disguised ninja, blended chakra already forming a swirling sphere in his hand. The ninja reacted swiftly and well, diving to the side rather than turning to face his attacker, but not swiftly enough. The Rasengan slammed into the side of the ninja's chest and shredded through flesh and bone with ease. Arcs of blood through the air as the ninja let out a choke scream before landing on the ground a short distance away. Blood continued to pour out of the ninja, but Kusha could tell that they had already died. Their body just didn't know it yet. "Holy shit," Temari breathed. "What the hell was that?" Kusha grinned, turning to face the genin and ignoring the copious amounts of blood splattered on his form. "That," he said, "is how you make sure an enemy stays down for good." Chapter 38, Unwelcome Reunions, Part 2, August 2nd, 347 NE, 10:25 AM. Konoha. "That," Kusha said, "is how you make sure an enemy stays down for good." "I'll say," Kankuro muttered, staring at the shattered mess that had been their attacker. Then he shook himself, turning his gaze to Kushu. "Never mind that though, how are you standing right now? I got a look at you before the fight really got going. You were, well, not okay," he finished lamely, realizing that Ino was standing right there. Temari just nodded silently in agreement, looking vaguely disturbed. Ino looked unperturbed, but then Kushu knew she understood that he could survive pretty much anything and so had no cause to worry. On the other hand, she had been rather upset judging by what she had threatened to do to their attacker. Gaara looked as impassive as ever, appearing more interested in his answer to Kankuro's question than worried about his health. Hinata had witnessed lesser feats of healing from him prior to this, although she looked rather pale and seemed to be staring at him with an odd intensity. Kusha shrugged. "I'm quite good at healing myself, and my condition is rather useful in that regard. I wouldn't expect that to work for anyone else in similar circumstances, though," he added. "Anyway, we need to keep moving." The others nodded quickly, saving any additional comments they may have had for later. They continued their journey towards their assigned shelter, paying much more attention to their surroundings and wary of any further attacks. They completed the rest of their journey without incident, arriving outside a small restaurant that appeared perfectly normal, only the name on the sign distinguishing it from the others around it. "Ino and Hinata will lead you to the actual shelter, but I have a different assignment," Kusha said. "I still don't like it," Hinata said suddenly, frowning. "What happens if you get hurt like you did earlier? You won't have anyone there to protect you." Kusha turned to face Hinata, curious. She had eventually accepted the plan when they discussed it last night, but she seemed to be having second thoughts now. "You are one of the targets," Kusha pointed out, "whereas I am not." The Hokage had decided it would be much easier to explain his role to his teammates if they were not told he was being targeted as well. But Hinata began, but was interrupted by an unexpected source. "I will accompany him," Gaara said calmly. "What?" Temari snapped. Gaara, we just fought off an assassin who was trying to kill you. You need to be in the shelter just as much as she does, and if I were attacked in such a confined space surrounded by other people, I would not be able to defend myself properly without endangering everyone else. Kusha clapped his hands together, the sudden sound cutting the brewing argument short. The Hokage appointed me the leader of this little group, so it's my call. Hinata and Gaara both have a point, and so Gaara will come with me. Between the two of us and our advantages, I doubt we'll run into anyone who could cause problems. Everyone else into the shelter. Now, their training dictated that they follow orders even when they didn't particularly like them, so the others eventually acquiesced and entered the restaurant, although not without some worried glances from Hinata. Kick some ass, little brother, Ino called out as she gently pushed Hinata through the door. Once they were out of sight, Kusha motioned to Gaara and hopped to the rooftops, where he paused as he focused on his senses and tried to determine the situation within Konoha. So why'd you really want to come with me? He asked, turning to Gaara. I have not had the chance to determine what I am fully capable of now, Gaara admitted. The circumstances of the exams were rather limiting. Looking for a real challenge, eh? Or is a certain someone itching to cut loose? Gaara didn't reply, but Kusha shrugged. Either way, I don't think we'll have a lot of luck. I'm not sensing anyone particularly interesting that we could run into. On the other hand, he said, his head turning, the Shinobi district seems to have the most action, and that's close enough that we could accidentally run into trouble. Shall we? Gaara nodded, and they both began hopping from rooftop to rooftop. 10:25 a.m. Shinobi distinct. Anko growled in annoyance as she took in the appearance of the Shinobi district. Large plumes of smoke were pouring out of nearly every building in sight, and in the distance she could see would-be thieves and looters scurrying about. Her teams had been in position to respond to any threats that may appear once the anticipated disruption actually occurred, but they had all been taken off guard by the sheer scale of the attack as well as those responsible. It hadn't been intentional, really, or even a conscious decision, but everyone from the Hokage on down had focused on potential attacks from foreign ninja or missing nin, and Anko and her team were no exception. She realized now that had been a mistake, as their current opponents were nothing more than normal thieves and bandits for the most part, and they had not adequately prepared to deal with large numbers of opponents. They had anticipated fighting highly skilled infiltrators and assassins, not dozens upon dozens of 2-bit thugs. The continuing detonations from exploding tags indicated that at least some among the enemy were capable of utilizing chakra, but the skill required to activate a correctly constructed exploding tag was D rank at most. All academy graduates were expected to be able to do at least that much. Chunin and even blooded genin could handle the people Anko was dealing with right now, but they were all assigned as reserves or to non-combat zones in anticipation that they would not be able to deal with the caliber of opponents likely to strike in the middle of a ninja village. They had already come across 2 corpses who had apparently blown themselves up, though, so it seemed that someone, a missing nin, most likely, had attempted to teach common thugs enough to activate tags without necessarily warning them about what could go wrong. The gaping holes in walls and the shattered doorways were telling signs that enough of them were skilled enough to be a threat. However, Anko spotted another small group of thieves making their way into one of the nearby apartment complexes and summoned up another group of snakes to take care of them. Her orders were to capture if possible, and with the relative skill levels of her team compared to the people they were facing, it was just as easy to capture them as it was to kill them. On the other hand, they already had quite a few prisoners and nowhere to take them at the moment, so she would likely make the call to begin taking out the thieves using more permanent means soon. Mitarashi-san, a Tokubetsu jounin said as he appeared nearby, my team has been dispatched to provide an update regarding the situation elsewhere within Konoha and to provide reinforcements if necessary. Anko motioned for him to follow her to a nearby rooftop and cleared the distance in a single leap, landing lightly on her feet. The Tokubetsu jounin landed a moment later, his team appearing around him. There were 4 of them, all chunin. Split them up into 2 groups, she ordered, and start taking out any thieves you spot. Capture or kill? Kill, she replied after a moment. We've got too many prisoners as it is, and I don't want to tie up any more ninja keeping track of them. Understood, the leader replied, and with a series of quick motions his subordinates had paired off and left the rooftop. Now give me that update. The enemy is using the Impure World Resurrection technique and has summoned the first Hokage, he replied. At this time there appears to be only one summon, although we do not believe that is the full extent of the attack. Hokage-sama and ANBU have moved to contain that threat while other teams are searching for the summoner. The stadium is currently being evacuated, with current estimates placing complete evacuation still 30 minutes away. All high-risk targets have already been secured, including the known targets. As of the time I was dispatched, there had been no attempts to infiltrate or attack the stadium. In addition, 3 missing nin, all A rank, have been killed. We believe that they were among those who accepted the bounties for the various targets. Anko nodded to herself, sorting through the information. All in all, they seemed to have things more or less in hand, though she found it very strange that no one had even attempted to target the stadium. She scanned around her, keeping an eye out for any further thieves, and noticed one standing outside a house near the edge of the district. He seemed to be doing something with the gate, though she couldn't quite make it out from here. She moved closer, clearing the distance between the buildings easily, and observed as the blond man lifted his hand, formed some sort of technique, and slammed it into the gate. There was a bright flash, and when her vision cleared the ground before the gate was charred and there was no sign of the would-be thief. Smirking, she realized that the thief, a ninja, judging by the technique, though a particularly stupid one, had attempted to force his way into the 4th Hokage's compound and run afoul of the security seals that guarded it. A moment later, she noticed movement at the base of the gate. There was some sort of small black object there, but it was rapidly obscured by a dark substance that coalesced seemingly out of thin air and took the shape of a man. She took in the blonde hair and the white coat, a white coat with a very distinctive flame design along the bottom edge. For a long moment, it felt like her heart had stopped beating. The next moment she was pushing her body as hard as she could and flaring her chakra in the agreed-upon emergency retreat signal. That signal meant that all of the ninja under her command were to disengage immediately and move to a designated location to regroup and reassess the situation. She snagged the newly arrived Tokubetsu-jounen a moment later, gripping his arm tightly as she carried him along with her. Fucking go back and tell them that they fucking called back the 4th too. Go, miles outside of Konoha. 10:30 a.m. Orochimaru frowned as he sat in a meditative pose in a small hideout miles outside of Konoha. Jirobo remained hidden for the moment under the rubble of the hotel, but he didn't expect that to last much longer. The showdown had successfully drawn the attention of the Hokage and a significant portion of ANBU, along with, he noted delightedly, another of his former experiments. The ANBU countering the showdowns would release techniques with his own was without a doubt one of the children he had gifted with power shortly before he left Konoha. The death toll on Konoha's side was fairly low, but then he didn't want to kill them. He wanted to wound them enough that they were sent to the various medical extraction points so that Sakan and Yukon could pick up some promising specimens. In that regard he was doing very well, as 5 ANBU and 3 Jounin had been removed from the battlefield by medical teams. The Nidaime had not been spotted as he moved stealthily towards the stadium, or at least none of the ninja in the area had reacted to his presence yet, but that would be changing very soon. And the Yandaime, well, that was proving to be rather irritating. Attempts to command him to open the gate, unlock the seal, or some variation thereof had all failed miserably. He had contemplated attempting to gain access through other areas, but it had quickly become obvious that there was a barrier protecting the entire estate and that the gate was the weakest point, not that the designation meant all that much. His last-ditch effort to simply destroy the gate entirely had instead destroyed the reconstructed body, as well as managing to slightly damage the anchor rod for the jutsu. He could readily admit that he was impressed by both the thoroughness and the lethality of the Yandaime's protections. It reminded him of how he protected his own possessions. Still, that left him without access to the Yandaime's house and any knowledge or tools stored there, so it was time to move on to the secondary option in the Hokage's tower. It was possible either the armory or the Hokage's office contained a working Hiraishin kunai. If not, a few exploding notes would still ensure that his visit was not entirely without merit. He shifted his attention back to the showdown for a moment, manipulating the forest around him to strike at the ninja closing in, then to the Nidaime as he crept ever closer to the stadium. Despite his preparations and planning, he still found that he had thoroughly underestimated the complexity of maintaining 3 separate entities under true battlefield conditions. The threads from the chakra teams were proving much more difficult to control than they had on prior occasions, and even with only one of his summons actively engaged in combat at the moment, he was still having trouble fully keeping track of the movements of the Hokage and his ANBU. He was gaining a great deal of useful experience from this, but it seemed that he would be better off controlling one body at a time than attempting to maintain a group of them. He would need to take that into account for future plans. His attention was pulled back to Jirobo as a swarm of Kakaichu descended on that body. He could feel them leeching away at the chakra moving through the resurrected ninja, but the anchor prevented them from severing or even significantly impairing the connection itself. A small chuckle escaped from Orochimaru's lips as he remotely observed the enlarged limb of an Akimichi crush Jirobo completely. the organs liquefying and bones shattering under the force of the giant ninja's blow. Time to begin Phase 2-10:35 a.m. Commercial District. The Hokage watched in satisfaction as the imitation of the first Hokage crumbled, the black rod that served as the anchor for the jutsu clattering to the ground a moment later. With that threat dealt with, the ninja gathered here could begin sweeping the village for more threats. He wasn't naive enough to believe that this was the extent of the threat, but this was certainly a large portion of it. He signaled for the other ninja to begin securing the area and splitting off into teams, then turned to his A and BU commander. Do you see anything we need to address immediately, Dragon, or should we fall back to check in with Shikaku? The other ninja didn't reply immediately. Hokage-sama, he said slowly, his voice tense. The ninja they just took out had a black rod implanted within him. The body was real, but that rod is identical to the one that was controlling the showdown. Something doesn't seem right about this. The Hokage frowned thoughtfully, turning to examine the forest once again. He opened his mouth to reply, but was interrupted by a massive surge of chakra coming from the direction of the stadium. Even from this distance, the enormous wall of water was easily visible. It stood taller than the stadium itself and looked to be several feet thick at least. He could also just barely make out someone standing atop the wall of water before the whole thing rushed forward and crashed into the stadium. It's the Nidain, Hokage-sama, Dragon bit out, his voice tense. Whoever is doing this has summoned him as well. Take command here, he snapped. Once you are certain that the situation is under control, dispatch as many ninja as you can spare to assist at the stadium. The evacuation likely isn't even half over yet, so the priority is to rescue as many civilians as possible. I will deal with the night aim. Understood, Hokage-sama? Dragon immediately turned his attention back to the situation at hand. One of the Akimichi was currently trying to break the black rod that served as the anchor tag for the showdown, but despite his immense strength he was unable to so much as bend it. Then the Akimichi let out a pained cry as a dark substance began to cover his arm and threw the rod to the ground. He began to frantically brush the ash off of his body, revealing that his flesh on his hands and arms had been eaten away. The other ninja in the area sprang into action, beginning to pelt the rod with a continuous series of jutsu to prevent the showdown from resurrecting. They seemed to be successful in destroying the ash that was forming out of thin air, but none of their attacks damaged the rod at all. Set up a rotation, he ordered. Don't bother trying to break the rod, just focus on keeping the body from reforming. His Byakugan was unable to find the source of the chakra that was surely flowing to the rod from somewhere, but the Byakugan wasn't the only option available. He turned to a nearby Aburame, asking, can your Kikaichu detect where the chakra is coming from? The Aburame hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I believe so. The chakra seems to be saturating the air around the anchor, but it seems to be slightly more concentrated in one direction. The Aburame released even more Kikaichu from his body until they filled the air around him, thousands upon thousands of small insects moving in all directions. After a moment, Dragon could also discern the pattern to their movements as they began to drift in one direction, towards the other enemy ninja that had been defeated less than a minute before. So, he is the source of the jutsu? He asked hesitantly. Why is it still working then? While he waited on the Aburame to determine what was going on, he shifted his focus in a quick scan of Konoha. The Hokage had arrived at the stadium and was personally combating the resurrected Nidain, while the ninjas still in the stadium were frantically scrambling to ward off the Nidain's attacks, which were focused on the still entranced civilians. The Genjutsu was beginning to break, however, and if they didn't get the situation back under control, the people still trapped in the stadium would begin to panic. If that happened, the casualties would only get worse. He turned his attention to the shinobi district, and his brow furrowed in confusion. He could see Anko flaring her chakra to signal a retreat, but couldn't determine any reason why she would do such a thing. He started to make a more thorough sweep of the area, but the Aburame spoke up and pulled his focus back to his current location. I do not believe that he is the source, the Aburame said finally, shaking his head. There are at least 4 directions where the chakra may be coming from, perhaps more. One leads back to the showdown, another towards the stadium, a third towards the shinobi district, and a fourth towards the Hokage Tower. I believe if we follow those threads we will eventually find the true source. Very well, Dragon said quickly. Pick out 3 more of your clansmen, and I'll assign each of you a squad of A and BU to support you. Your sole objective is to find and eliminate the source of chakra that is sustaining the impure world resurrection jutsu. Yes, Dragon-sama, the Aburame said quickly, moving off to carry out his orders. Dragon then turned his attention back to the teams who were dealing with the anchor rods. As per his orders, there was a group of 5 shinobi who were alternating jutsu at a measured pace, as well as 10 more ready to step into place should it prove necessary. Deciding not to take any risks, He directed that the second ninja's body be moved next to the showdame's anchor rod so that both could be eliminated at the same time. The body did not seem to be regenerating as the showdame's did, but that didn't mean it couldn't given the opportunity. Soon the body had been completely destroyed and both tags were bathed in a constant stream of fire. Satisfied that they had the situation under control, Dragon designated 10 ninja to maintain their attacks on the rods and sent the rest towards the stadium. As he did so, a Tokubetsu Jounin arrived via Shunshin, his face clearly panicked. "Hokage-sama!" he called out, his voice tense with fear. "Hokage-sama is dealing with the resurrected Nidame at the stadium," Dragon replied calmly. "You can deliver your message to me." "The Nidame too?" the ninja yelped. "Kami, they resurrected all of them." A sudden hush fell over the assembled ninja, even the steady stream of fire jutsu faltering for a moment. "What do you mean, all of them?" Dragon asked lowly, his voice tense. "Mitarashi Jounin sent a report that the resurrected Yandame was spotted outside the Namikaze compound," the ninja shouted. Dragon quickly stifled his fear, calling upon his years of experience to remain focused and rational. At least now he knew why Anko had abandoned the shinobi district. After all, the Yandame was the only ninja in the history of the elemental nations who had earned a universal flea-on-sight order. Even Sarutobi-sama couldn't claim that distinction. He was fully in control of himself a moment later, his mind already analyzing how he should respond. Judging by the capabilities shown by the resurrected Showdame, the Yandame would be far from his peak condition. It also seemed that he was not able to use the Hiraishin for some reason, else they would likely already be dead. Even without the Hiraishin, however, the Yandame still had the Rasengan, which made him incredibly dangerous to combat at close range. Not for the first time, Dragon cursed his clan's stubborn insistence on focusing so heavily on their taijutsu skills. His own abilities at long-range combat were limited at best, barely meriting an A rank. It was also unclear how effective the Jukin would be against a ninja brought back by the impure world resurrection technique. If they could eliminate the body, they should be able to keep him down just as easily as they were preventing the Showdame from reforming. Accomplishing that task in the first place might be beyond their capabilities, however. 10:40 a.m. Stadium. What could you possibly hope to gain from this? The Hokage snarled as he faced off against the resurrected Nidame. Konoha will never rest until we have eliminated the ones who are behind this attack. You have only succeeded in signing your own death warrant. Whoever was controlling the jutsu did not respond immediately, instead summoning another wall of water out of thin air and sending it crashing towards another group of civilians. The ninja guarding the stadium were prepared this time, however, and the wall was met by ramparts of earth and stone even as the Konoha ninja with water affinities pulled the wall apart or forced it to move away from the civilians. The kurama were struggling to maintain the genjutsu, keeping the crowd calm and organized, and some sections of the crowd had already broken free and had begun rushing towards the nearest exit. With the stadium breached, the ninja who were previously guarding the walls and keeping an eye out for any attackers were now assisting with the evacuation, but it was still going far too slowly for the Hokage's peace of mind. He froze when he heard a hauntingly familiar laugh issue from the Nidame's mouth. "Kukuku," the Nidame chuckled, a smirk crossing his face. His movements suddenly became far more fluid, a sharp change from the stilted, halting motions punctuated by moments of grace that had characterized them before now. "I'm hurt, sensei. You make it sound like you weren't already trying to kill me before now." Orochimaru, the Hokage growled, his emotions torn between seething hatred and bitter self-recrimination. His moment of weakness so many years before had come back to haunt his village in the worst way possible. "Does your depravity never cease? Must you defile the memory of the Hokages in this manner?" Even as he spoke, his mind was racing as he added this new knowledge to his understanding of the situation. It seemed obvious now that Orochimaru was the one who wanted the various bloodline-bearing children kidnapped. He was undoubtedly trying to continue the inhumane experiments that had turned the village against him in the first place. That might even explain who was after Anko, though he shuddered to think what his fallen student would do to the newly promoted Jounin in the name of research. As for the bounty on Naruto, that seemed unlikely. His student had never shown any interest in Jinchuriki before, although that could have changed in the years since he had fled Konoha. Sarutobi still felt like he was still missing a piece of the puzzle, though. All of the known targets were being handled by mercenaries and missing nin, which was the complete opposite of Orochimaru's normal method of operation. Like Anko had said, anything truly important he handled himself, which meant the real purpose of this attack lay elsewhere. The Showdame was already taken care of, however, and the Nidame stood before him. "So, you didn't?" the Hokage gasped, his face paling. "Didn't what, sensei?" the Nidame hissed, his tone mocking. As he spoke, more water coalesced, this time forming into a towering dragon that he sent rampaging into the stadium. The outer walls broke apart, and part of the interior was destroyed before the water dragon was met by 3 smaller dragons fashioned of earth and stone. The titanic creatures began to crash against one another, their serpentine bodies coiling around their opponents, and claws digging into water or stone. The battle seemed even for the moment, but the water dragon was prevented from pursuing the fleeing civilians. The Hokage barked a laugh then, and his expression changed to a look of pity. You couldn't figure it out, could you? Not even after you tore part of his soul out of the afterlife. You, who have thrown aside all morals and limits in the pursuit of knowledge, are still scrabbling desperately to reach the feet of my successor. Sarutobi darted forward, the adamantine staff in his hands blurring as it assaulted the Nidaime from all sides. The Nidaime dodged what he could and allowed the unnatural regeneration of the jutsu to restore the damage he took from the blows he was unable to avoid. The Nidaime's efforts were focused on summoning more attacks to send into the stadium, and he got off 2 more despite the Hokage's intervention. The Nidaime's expression twisted. As if you could possibly understand the beauty of what I have accomplished. No technique ever created shall remain beyond my reach. He laughed then. Even you shall die before long, perhaps even today, and then I shall learn from the professor once again. I may have taught you much, Orochimaru, but it seems you have learned nothing, the Hokage said, his expression hardening. A moment later the staff thrust forward and impaled the other ninja. The Nidaime's eyes widened as he felt the massive amount of chakra closing in, and he tried to tear himself off of the staff. Before he could, though, the adamantine staff in the Hokage's hands burst into smoke, revealing Enma. The Monkey King wrapped his body around the Nidaime, preventing the simulacrum from moving out of the way. Dynamic entry! Madogai called out joyously as he leapt into the fray from behind the Nidaime, his whirling kick catching the Nidaime in the back and flinging him into the air. Enma dispersed himself a moment later, leaving the Nidaime alone in the air. Guy paused a moment, breathing deeply. Chakra was pouring off of his body and his skin had reddened, while his eyes were completely white. He exhaled sharply, then leapt into the air, proclaiming, "Morning Peacock!" His fists blurred into motion, and the very air around him began to ignite until a fiery trail followed the path of his hands with every strike. Each blow shattered the construct that was the Nidaime, clothing and skin reverting into ash once again before burning away completely. The form of the Nidaime was no longer even recognizable mere moments later, but still Guy's attack did not falter. Soon the black rod that served as the anchor for the jutsu was visible from within a misshapen lump of ash, and still Guy's onslaught continued. The Hokage could feel the heat generated by Guy's attack from the roof of the stadium. He smiled slightly to himself as he watched one of his most loyal and effective shinobi in action. He turned his head then as he heard a crackling sound from the left, and saw Kakashi crouch slightly, one hand held in front of him with a blade formed of lightning chakra extending from his fingers. "Guy!" Kakashi called, then immediately darted forward and leapt into the air. Guy seemed to understand the signal as he ceased his attack and seized the black rod, positioning it so that Kakashi would have a clear cut at it. Ash began forming around the rod, and Guy went slightly as it began to eat into his flesh, but the rod did not change position in the slightest. Kakashi was there a moment later, the Raikiri technique moving through the rod. There was a tense silence on the roof for a moment, then Guy pulled his arms apart, revealing that the rod had been split cleanly in half. The ash fell away a moment later, revealing Guy's bleeding but mostly intact hands. "Well done, both of you," the Hokage said as they landed. "However, this is not over yet. The 4th Hokage has also been resurrected and is likely somewhere within the village. We need to find him as soon as possible." "Understood, Hokage-sama," the two responded in unison. Their expressions were tense but they were both ready to follow their Hokage into battle. All 3 vanished in a shunshin a moment later. 10:40 a.m. Outside of Konoha, Itachi perched in the branches of a tree far above the clearing, observing the 2 ninja who had fled the records department. He watched for any sign that they may have noticed someone following them, but they gave no indication of that. Instead, it seemed like they had reached their destination for the moment, as they relaxed slightly and began to rest. There was a tense silence between them, and they did not remain near each other for very long, but there were no signs of imminent betrayal by one or the other either. That they were stopping here meant this was probably a rendezvous point, which meant that additional ninja could show up at any time. His chakra wasn't entirely restored yet, but he had more than enough to take on the 2 in the clearing below. The longer he delayed, the more likely it was that they would get reinforcements, or that a third party would intervene and make the situation even more complicated. He moved closer, his steps completely silent as he walked down the side of the tree, and pulled out 4 kunai. This particular trick he had learned long ago, but it had never stopped being useful. After taking a moment to make sure his targets would remain still, he threw 2 of the kunai and performed a variation of the bunshin technique. To the ninja in the clearing, it appeared as if a swarm of kunai were lancing towards them from every direction. The gray-haired Konoha ninja threw himself out of the way, rolling desperately to avoid the lethal projectiles. The Otonin was much calmer, spinning behind the tree he had been leaning against and running through a quick series of hand seals before creating a dome of earth to shield him. Though it wasn't visible, Itachi could feel the tiny pulse of chakra indicating that the ninja had slipped underground and was moving out of the clearing swiftly. Clearly the Otonin was much more skilled and experienced, and thus the greater threat, but he would take care of the Konoha ninja first. He watched the ninja continue to scramble about for a moment, then hefted the other 2 kunai he held and threw them. Both struck true, one piercing the ninja's throat and the other striking his chest and penetrating his heart with a solid thunk. The ninja crumpled to the ground and expired a moment later. Noting that the other ninja was still moving away from the clearing, Itachi leapt to the forest floor and swiftly sealed the Konoha ninja's corpse into a storage scroll. He would take the time to examine the corpse for any useful items or information later. That done, he set off in pursuit of the fleeing Otonin. 30 seconds after Itachi left the clearing, 2 black-cloaked ninja entered it. One had a nodachi strapped across their back while the other had no visible weapons. "Someone died here," the second said in a distorted voice as they knelt next to the blood staining the grass. "Looks like another ninja took the body, probably in a storage scroll. There's a battle taking place to the northwest." "I don't recognize either of the signatures, though," the first ninja said, their voice equally distorted. "We'll check it out. We can't help out inside Konoha, but we can take care of any problems outside the walls." With that, they both left the clearing. The shadow clone Itachi had left behind observed their interaction curiously as he attempted to discern the identity and purpose of the 2 ninja. They matched the descriptions he had heard for the infamous sword and hammer duo. The nodachi was an unusual weapon, especially for a ninja, but those 2 were independents. There had been no indication prior to this that they worked for Konoha in any capacity, not even in rumor. After a moment, the clone dispersed to alert his creator of the pursuers he would soon have to deal with. Chapter 39, Unwelcome Reunions, Part 3, August 2nd, 347 NE, 10:45 AM. Konoha, Shinobi District. Kushu stopped on a roof at the edge of the Shinobi District and observed the situation. The Konoha ninja were rapidly withdrawing from the area, their movements barely organized enough to avoid being called a total retreat. There were over 100 minuscule signatures that denoted civilians moving about, and roughly a dozen signatures large enough to qualify as ninja. The largest signature in the district was strange. It felt like there were actually several different signatures woven together, but then they were being subsumed into another, stronger signature that was both human and not. It was chakra, certainly, but it lacked some vital quality that was present in the other ninja. He pondered for a moment, eventually deciding that it felt more like a concentration of recently expended chakra than anything else, although even that wasn't fully accurate. Anything that unusual was worth looking into, he decided, and so he headed in that direction with Gaara following along silently. A few moments later they intercepted the signature as it leapt from roof to roof, and they all paused to take stock of one another. Kushu recognized who the man appeared to be, of course, but that was one signature he would not be forgetting any time soon. What he sensed from the thing before him vaguely resembled the feel of the Yandame's chakra, but only to a point. Physically, on the other hand, the likeness was perfect. "Interesting," Gaara said, a small smile growing on his face. "I thought the 4th Hokage was dead." "He is," Kushu replied easily, studying the thing before him curiously. "Of that you can be absolutely certain, which does make me wonder what is standing before us now." "Soon as Jinchuriki and the Yamanaka boy." "Interesting," the Yandame said. "Kukuku, you should have stayed hidden away like good little children." "And why is that?" Kushu asked mockingly. "You would have lived longer," the Yandame said. Then he moved. Kushu's eyes widened. He was easily moving as fast as Lee after he dropped his weights, which was much faster than he had expected to deal with initially. Even as he reinforced his body with Yuki and cursed himself for not doing so earlier, his eyes widened even further as he realized that he was not the Yandame's target. Gaara, or Ryudo, more likely, had not been as complacent about the possible dangers within Konoha. A wall of sand was already moving to intercept the Yandame. Kushu cursed when he saw the little blue orb that had appeared in the Yandame's hand, and one appeared in each of his own as he darted towards the other ninja. The Yandame's Rasengan broke through the wall of sand like it was paper, which probably saved Gaara's life. Rather than destroying the sand barrier completely, it punched a hole in it that allowed the Yandame's arm to continue but stopped the rest of his body, and thus limited his reach. This meant that the orb merely grazed Gaara's shoulder rather than driving into his chest. Kushu thrust both of his hands forward towards the Yandame's torso, snarling viciously. One impacted the left side of the Yandame's chest from behind, but rather than the blood he had expected a stream of what appeared to be dirt and ash spewed into the air. The other Rasengan, held in his right hand, never made it. The Yandame's other hand whipped through the air, the familiar blue orb forming in a heartbeat in his upward-facing palm as it almost gently slid past Kushu's elbow. His flesh, hardened by Yuki, and his bones, strengthened far past normal human limits over the years, disintegrated under the force of the attack. His right hand and most of his lower arm were still intact as they spun away from him, the Rasengan he had held dissipating into the air. He stared at the severed limb for a moment, then turned to face the ninja responsible, his face completely blank. The Yandame paused, looking back and forth between the two young ninja before him with a cruel smirk on his face even as what should have been a fatal wound restored itself with ash that appeared out of nowhere. Gaara was packing his wound with sand and cradling his right arm against his body. His expression was caught between shock and seething hatred as he stared at the man who had wounded him. Kukuku. I wonder what Sensei would think if he could see me now. The greatest Hokage Konoha has ever known, using his talents to maim innocent children within its streets. How delightful. He turned to face Kushu, a look of fake pity on his face. I suppose the lost limb means the end of your oh-so-promising career, he said. I guess the kind thing would be to put you out of your misery. The Yandame raised his hands again, creating two more orbs within them. Gaara, Kushu said, his voice flat, keep him from running. The Yandame's expression faltered slightly. What? Yuki bubbled out of the stump on Kushu's arm, halting the blood loss but extending no further for the moment. That, Kushu said, motioning to the arm lying on the ground a short distance away, is going to be very annoying to fix. There was a slight rumbling from underneath them, and Kushu glanced over to see Gaara crouching with both hands placed on the ground, his face pulled into a grimace as he concentrated. Ryudo's Yuki was slowly leaking out of his body, and even from here Kushu could feel his brother straining against the limits imposed by the seal. You're both Jinchuriki, the Yandame said suddenly, his voice delighted. So that's where Sensei hid you all those years ago. How clever of him. Even I was fooled by that. The streets around them cracked suddenly, and massive walls of earth rose up to surround Kushu and the Yandame. Gaara himself remained outside the walls. Wisely, Kushu thought. The Jinchuriki lacked the command of Ryudo's Yuki he would need to contribute in what was about to happen. Kushu was plunged into near-complete darkness as Gaara completed the sealing of the impromptu cage. The only light was that given off by his own Yuki and the Rasengan held in the Yandame's hands. He raised the Yuki concentration in his eyes, completing the transformation into their blood-red form, and the darkness parted before his enhanced vision. You don't actually think this is going to hold me, do you? The Yandame asked curiously. He didn't seem concerned at all by his sudden confinement. If anything, he looked amused. It will slow you down and limit your movements, Kushu responded easily. I think I can reach you faster than you can blast a hole in these walls, and if you want to try to slip through them or into the ground while Gaara is controlling them, well, that would be an amusing way to end this. As he spoke, the Yuki bubbling out of the stump of his arm extended further until it formed a rough approximation of his lost appendage. He flexed the Yuki slightly, as if he was testing the muscles within it. The Yandame nodded thoughtfully as he eyed the new limb. I see. And what do you intend to do now that you are trapped in here with me? I find myself in a life-or-death situation once again. Kushu grinned viciously as he flooded the rest of his body with Yuki. So I'm going to panic, the Yandame laughed. Panic? That is your solution. Kushu grinned as 9 streams of chakra extended from the base of his spine, forming his signature tails. If he was going to cut loose for the first time since his incarceration, he was going to do it properly. Yeah, he said as the Yuki concentration in his body peaked. Panic? Then the tips of each tail began to spin, and the Yandame wasn't laughing anymore. Emergency Shelter 12. Hinata paced restlessly back and forth within the emergency shelter, her Byakugan activated, and her head swiveling back and forth. Hinata, he's going to be fine, Ino chided gently. How can you say that? Hinata snapped, whirling on her teammate. He almost died earlier, and now he's out there with only one other person to protect him. That person being Gaara, Ino pointed out. If there's something those two can't handle, do you honestly think we'd be of any help? There was a bit of frustration in her voice that showed she wasn't entirely happy with the situation either. Hinata deflated slightly. Hey Nei-chan, Hanabi said, tugging on her sister's sleeve. What do you mean Naruto almost died earlier? Hinata winced then, noting the curious and concerned looks she was getting from the other people in the shelter. Her father, who had his own Byakugan activated and appeared to be keeping track of the situation within the village, frowned slightly in response to the question, his expression pensive. He had likely seen what happened earlier, and was as disturbed as Hinata by how Naruto had seemingly ignored his brush with death. Hinata opened her mouth to answer, but her attention was drawn back to the figures of Naruto and Gaara as they confronted an enemy shinobi. There was something oddly familiar about the other figure, though she noticed immediately that what they were facing was not a real ninja at all but some sort of construct. No, Hayashi breathed softly. "Tusan," Hinata said slowly, "what's wrong?" "Who is that?" "What?" Ino asked. "What's going on out there?" Hayashi turned to face them, his expression pained. "Naruto and Gaara have just," he began, but was interrupted by Hinata's scream as the construct attacked them using the Rasengan, the same jutsu Naruto-kun had recently learned from the sage Jiraiya. "What?" Ino yelled, grabbing hold of Hinata. "What happened?" "Naruto-kun, his arm." Hinata stuttered out in a horrified voice. Ino blinked. "His arm? What about his arm?" "That thing, it used the Rasengan and severed his right arm." Ino blanched, then let out a shaky breath. "Hey, it's Naruto. He can fix that, no problem." "Ino," Hayashi said softly, "even for someone of his unique talents such an injury is what? What is he doing?" Hinata growled. She whirled on Temari and Kankuro, her expression fierce. "Why is your brother trapping Naruto-kun with that thing?" The two Suna ninja just looked mystified. "Hey, we've got no idea what's going on out there," Kankuro said, raising his hands defensively. "You guys are the ones with the all-seeing eyes, not us. I can't see inside there." Hinata hissed. "Your brother's chakra is too thick." Temari and Kankuro exchanged glances before they turned back to the distraught girl. "I don't know what to tell you," Temari said, "but Gaara wouldn't just abandon Naruto. There must be a reason he's doing that." "So Naruto is trapped inside some sort of cage that you can't see through with that other ninja?" Ino asked calmly, pulling Hinata's attention away from the Suna siblings. "Yes," Hayashi answered for his daughter. He was observing Ino closely, an odd expression on his face. "He'll be fine," Ino said, patting Hinata on the shoulder. "You know Naruto works best in close quarters. Gaara is probably just making sure the enemy can't take the fight to long range." Hinata nodded uncertainly but allowed herself to be soothed by Ino's words. If Naruto's own sister was that certain, then shouldn't she have faith in him too? Hayashi just watched their interaction with narrowed eyes. Medical triage point near the Hokage Tower. "Take a break, Kabuto-kun," Shizen said, pulling him away from his patient. "You need to restore your chakra before you pass out." "Very well, Shizen-sama," Kabuto said, wiping the sweat from his face. His hands were shaking slightly and he swayed in place. "You are right, as always." Shizen tossed him a quick grin before taking over where he had left off, her hands glowing green as she worked. Kabuto made his way out of the critical care area, his weary gaze sweeping the triage center as he walked. Dozens of shinobi and civilians in various states of injury were spread throughout the warehouse, and he could spot two who had died in the midst of surgery and were left where they were as the mednines working on them immediately shifted their efforts to other patients who were still breathing. As he watched, two Chunin hurried over and sealed away the bodies, making careful notations on the scrolls, then prepared the tables to receive a new patient for surgery. Initially the situation had been under control, a steady but slow trickle of injured ninja coming in from the battle in the center of the village. Many had been impaled by what appeared to be tree branches and wooden spears, but the majority of them were likely to survive their wounds. Then the massive influx of injured civilians from the stadium had come in and the brisk but organized state of the triage center had dissolved into chaos, as the number of injured far outstripped the medical staff they have available to treat them. As the number of injured increased, the goal of the medical team shifted from healing, possibly to battle readiness once again, to stabilizing as quickly as possible and moving on. This meant that a lot of ninja, especially those injured in the stadium, were still in delicate states. Kabuto watched as the scrolls containing the deceased ninja were carried past him and into a separate room, the same room, as it happened, where the chakra pills and other supplies were stored. He frowned when the two Chunin did not return immediately. He was waiting on them to leave before he made his move. None of the other ninja, even the ones tasked with guarding the warehouse, seemed to notice their absence, however. He didn't dare delay much longer. From the reports he had overheard, the situation outside seemed to be winding down, and things would only get calmer from here. He made his way towards the storage room, smiling wearily at the guard who nodded to him respectfully. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him even as he noted the slight scent of blood that wafted out of the door when he opened it. When he felt the blow coming from the side, he shed his weary facade and quickly slipped past the attack, driving a chakra scalpel into the attacker's head. The Otonin didn't even have time register shock as he dropped bonelessly to the ground. Kabuto frowned when he saw the body still moving. "You bastard!" came a strangled scream from underneath the corpse. Suddenly a second ninja, identical to the first, emerged from within the body. "I'll fucking kill you!" the ninja howled. Kabuto felt an odd pulse of chakra and noted the black symbols crawling rapidly over the ninja's body. This was undoubtedly some sort of powerful technique, perhaps even a suicide technique. That wouldn't do at all. Kabuto's hands blurred and the second ninja died just as quickly as the first. Whatever technique he had been about to unleash receding into his body as he expired. "Now then," Kabuto said, adjusting his glasses slightly, "I better make this quick." 2 minutes later, the ninja guarding the warehouse was shocked when the door to the storage room was shattered and the gray-haired medic Nin was thrown out of the room. There was a kunai lodged in his stomach and blood was leaking from his lips. "An enemy," he gasped, before his eyes rolled back in his head and he passed out. An explosion rocked the storage room a moment later. "Shinobi District. What are you?" the yandere asked, staring at the Rasengan-tipped tails. "No Jinchuriki has that level of control over the chakra of the tailed beasts, especially not so young." "Is that so?" Kusha said, taking a step forward. His vicious grin widened even further when he noticed the yandere tense. "Then I suppose you have nothing to worry about." One of the tails lanced forward, crossing the short distance between them in a heartbeat. The Rasengan at the tip of the tail was met by one in the yandere's hand, the two techniques grinding against one another with a horrible screeching noise. After a moment spent locked in a stalemate, the Rasengan deflected off of each other, and the tails shot past the yandere. The man was no fool, however, and he sprang away even as Kusha pulled the tail back in an attempt to catch him off guard. "So that's what happens when two Rasengan meet," Kusha said musingly. "Good to know." "Kukuku," the yandere chuckled, "what a fascinating thing you are. Perhaps I was wrong to dismiss Jinchuriki so easily. It would seem that the Rasengan is not the best option to fight you, so I wonder how you will handle this." The yandere allowed the Rasengan he held to dissipate, and brought his hands together before forming an astonishingly rapid sequence of seals. He then thrust his hands forward, not even bothering to state the name of the jutsu he was using. Kushu wrapped his tails around his body as he noticed a slight shimmer in the air, the telltale sign of a powerful wind jutsu being used. He felt the leading edge of a massive blade of wind slicing into his yuki a moment later. The attack didn't reach his body, but it penetrated his yuki barrier far more than he would have liked. The outer edges of the blade of wind hit the wall of earth behind him, creating a gap in the wall that slowly sealed back up. "Interesting. The chakra you are using is far denser than human chakra, and you seem to be under no discernible strain while using it. How long can you keep that up, I wonder?" His hands blurred once again, then slapped the ground. There was a small tremble, but nothing happened beyond that. "And the other one can suppress earth jutsu, to a point," Kusha frowned. Whatever this thing really was, it didn't seem at all concerned about its situation. The way it was acting now was like a curious child playing with a new toy. 3 of his tails snapped forward, the Rasengan at their tips aiming unerringly for the other ninja. The yandere chuckled as he reformed 2 Rasengan and began intercepting the tails. Each of Kushu's attacks was met unerringly by the yandere's hands, the Rasengan deflecting off of one another, and the yandere dancing out of range a moment later. "What else should I try?" the man mused to himself. One of the tails broke through his guard, taking out his left hip and the attached leg in another shower of dirt and ash, but he didn't seem to care. He used his remaining leg ably as his hands continued to deflect and the missing limb reformed quickly. I know," he said suddenly, and suddenly one of his hands lashed out, the palm pointed straight at Kushu. This much more concentrated attack proved disturbingly effective, Kushu noted, as it pierced the 6 tails he had guarding his form and dug into his shoulder. The damage to his body was minimal and quickly healed, but it seemed that the amount of yuki he was using externally was not going to be sufficient for this level of battle. "Not so effective there, is it?" the yandere asked mockingly. "No, I suppose it's not. I'll have to look into that," Kushu replied. "Thanks for the tip." He didn't give the other ninja any more time for his experiments, as he lashed out with all 9 of his tails and began moving his body as well. The ninja managed to deflect 3 tails before the others began carving through the ash that passed for his body. A moment later, a black rod emerged from within the rapidly dissolving yandere and clattered to the ground. Kushu grasped the rod with one of his tails, noting that even now ash was trying to form around it but was burned away by his yuki. He pushed his yuki inside the object, noting the small fractures throughout. Focusing his yuki inside the rod, He shattered it into 1,000 pieces and the ash stopped. He allowed his tails to recede within his body as he pondered what sort of jutsu had brought back the yondaime. Gaara allowed the walls to collapse shortly thereafter. Kushi noted that the other Jinchuriki's form was dripping with sweat, and his face was pale and strained. The Tsunagenin fell backwards, lying on his back and staring at the sky as he panted in exhaustion. The sand covering the wound on his shoulder seemed to be keeping the wound sealed, for the moment. Satisfied that Gaara was fine for the moment, Kushi turned to the handful of powerful Konoha ninja who had shown up during his battle. He noted that the Hokage and the ANBU commander were present, as well as Kakashi, Guy, and a handful of additional ANBU and Jounin. "Hey, Hokage GG," he said, grinning widely and waving. He turned to look at Kakashi and Guy as he heard their grunts of surprise and noted that they were staring at his right arm. "Pretty handy, huh?" he said, gesturing with the not-so-missing limb. He then trudged over and picked up the severed appendage with the chakra limb. The Yuki poured into the arm and held it in place as the fingers wiggled and the fist clenched. After a moment, the only sign anything was wrong was the section around the elbow that was formed entirely of Yuki. Then he groaned. "I did not just say that, ugh." He turned to Kakashi, who was still staring at him wide-eyed. "Don't tell Ino about that one, she'd never let me live it down." Kushi shook his head disgustedly. "Now then," he continued, looking to the Hokage, "could someone please explain to me why the fourth Hokage just tried to kill us?" Miles outside of Konoha, Orochimaru frowned as he felt the yondaime's anchor break. That was twice now that the incredibly durable metal had been destroyed. He had expected the tags to last much longer than that, and certainly hadn't expected Konoha to respond nearly as well as they had to the nature of the jutsu. More than anything, it served as an annoying reminder of the difference in quality between the average ninja in Oto and Konoha. He triggered the fail-safe mechanism on the two remaining anchors, causing them to shatter and completely ruining the sealing arrays inscribed upon them. It wouldn't do for Konoha to get a chance to study his design and devise yet more ways to counter his jutsu. He also sent the signal to the chakra battery teams to withdraw. He had expected that part of the plan to be the weak point, actually, so their survival was something of a pleasant surprise. Unfortunately, none of them were useful for anything except their chakra reserves, so it wasn't much of a benefit either. He stood and stretched, his awareness fully returning to his own body once again, and began contemplating everything he had learned. The first field test of the Impure World Resurrection technique had proven most informative, but it was the final exchange with Konoha's hidden Jinchuriki that intrigued him the most. The degree of control the boy displayed forced Orochimaru to reevaluate some of his previous conclusions concerning the utility of the tailed beasts. Perhaps securing one for himself, either as a member of his forces or otherwise, would be worth the risk after all. Still deep in thought, he began his trek to the rendezvous point to meet up with his subordinates. He had performed his part in the plan to perfection, as always, so he would accept no excuses if they failed to accomplish their own tasks. He allowed a small chuckle to escape his lips. His last present to Konoha should be activating soon. It was a shame he would miss the fireworks. Outside of Konoha, Itachi leapt through the treetops, easily keeping pace with the fleeing Otonin tunneling under the ground. His first instinct was to use the rock crusher jutsu Konoha had developed during the Third War to take out the other ninja while he was underground, but that could damage the scrolls he was carrying. Any other attacks while he was underground also carried that same risk, so he would have to force the Otonin back to the surface. He was also mindful of his limited time to act. The two ninja following him were closing in fast, and he didn't want to deal with them at the same time as he was recovering the stolen scrolls. After a moment, he dropped to the ground and tapped his foot on the dirt beneath him. He used no seals and did not speak the name of the jutsu. He did not consider his skill with a jutsu acceptable until he could perform it near instantly, and without any tells. As the jutsu took effect, the Otonin found himself surrounded by water that bubbled up from beneath him. The water was not passive, either, as it clung to his frame and slid towards his face. The Otonin burst from the ground a moment later, his hands clawing at the water surrounding his head. His panic faded quickly, however, and he performed a short series of seals that caused the water to drop to the ground. As soon as the water was clear, he sucked in several deep breaths and turned to face his attacker, who was standing in the middle of the clearing, watching him calmly. "Who the fuck are you?" Kidamaru snarled, his hands reaching for kunai. He stiffened as he felt the blade sliding into his back, severing his spine and almost gently piercing his heart. The form of the enemy ninja in front of him burst apart into a murder of crows. He never even sensed the enemy behind him. Itachi sealed the corpse and everything it carried into another storage scroll, then turned to face the two ninja who would be entering the clearing in just a few moments. They had traveled too quickly for him to evade them entirely, so he would have to take another approach. He slipped his old Konoha headband on, and adjusted his stance to a calm but wary posture with his blade held in front of him defensively. A black cloak obscured the civilian clothing he was wearing, but even if that was revealed, he was prepared to explain that he had been hidden among the population to pursue any infiltrators. "Identify yourselves," he said as the two cloaked and disguised ninja landed in front of him. Their masks were apparently ANBU, or at least ANBU style, as their voices were distorted. "We are not enemies," the unarmed one responded, making a pacifying motion. "We merely wish to assist Konoha during this crisis in order to build goodwill between ourselves and the village. While concealing your identities, you could just as easily be trying to lull us into a false sense of security." The other ninja nodded calmly. "Possibly, yes. Our actions will show that is not the case, however. Why are you out here alone?" the other ninja asked suddenly. Itachi frowned, a sad expression pulling at his face. "My partner was killed earlier, and I just finished executing the one responsible for his death." His frown deepened when another of his sentries informed him that a Konoha patrol was closing in on their location. "My condolences," the first ninja said. "Thank you," he said, his face firming into a stoic mask once again. "While I appreciate your efforts, I must return to Konoha to report to my commander." "Of course," came the distorted reply. "Wait," the other ninja said. "Do you know what happened inside the stadium? Was it attacked?" Before Itachi had time to reply, the patrol from Konoha landed in the clearing, the four ninjas surrounding the three already within it. "Identify yourselves," the leader of the team snapped. "We are not enemies," the first ninja repeated. "Prove it," the leader snapped. "We are two lilies floating down a river," the first ninja replied, drawing an odd look from the other Konoha ninja. The leader, however, relaxed marginally and replied, "The waterfall is looming ahead, but there are no rocks." "Alright, you know the proper passcode at least, so I'll take you at your word for now." He turned his attention to the other ninja in the clearing, the one wearing a Konoha headband. "And who are you?" "Ayasu Kunichika, Tokubetsu Jounin, serving under Commander Akimichi." The Konoha ninjas stiffened, all of their attention suddenly focused on him. "That's our unit, and I don't know you," Itachi cursed mentally. His luck seemed to be turning sour quickly. It was time to leave. "Wait, what?" came the distorted comment from the first cloaked ninja. "You mean he's not a Konohanin? Then who the hell did he just kill?" Before the other ninja could process that statement, Itachi's chakra washed over the clearing, snaring everyone within in a genjutsu. He left in a shunshin a moment later, opting for speed and distance over discretion at this point. He frowned when he felt two signatures following him. He was not moving as fast as he possibly could, but he was still moving fast enough that most ninjas should be unable to keep up at all. Sword and Hammer deserved their reputations as S-class ninja, it seemed. Hammer appeared in front of him, the ninja's hands concealed within their cloak while Sword stopped behind him. He could hear the nearly silent scrape of metal on leather as Sword drew the nodachi. "This is not necessary," Itachi said calmly as he turned his body to keep both of them in his line of sight. "Independents should not interfere with one another, especially not for the sake of a hidden village." "Unfortunately for you," Hammer said, "we have a reason to interfere. If you're smart, you will surrender now. You are outnumbered and in over your head." Itachi sighed. "As you wish," he said. He brought his hand up and wiped it over his face in what appeared to be a frustrated gesture. When his hand lowered, his contacts had been removed and his Sharingan was activated and spinning madly. Since he was facing two highly skilled opponents, and with a strict time limit before even more enemies arrived to join the battle, he would have to strike with overwhelming force. He launched another genjutsu, this one targeted specifically at Hammer, then moved towards Sword. With their masks completely covering their faces, he could not establish the direct eye contact required for Sharingan-based genjutsu, but that was far from the limit of his skills. He saw Sword draw in a sharp breath before he heard the almost whispered, "Itachi." With his Sharingan revealed, it was inevitable they would recognize him. He was the only Uchiha he knew of outside of Konoha, after all, and that fact alone made him rather famous. But that hardly mattered at the moment. What mattered was the absolute explosion of killing intent he felt from both Sword and Hammer. His Sharingan showed him what would happen before it actually did, but seeing and understanding were entirely different things. The streams of chakra that emerged from Sword's form were unlike anything he had ever witnessed, and even as he leapt away from what he assumed was an attack, his brow furrowed. The only thing even remotely similar to that was Kush's Yuki when he manifested it outside his body. But there were still substantial differences. Then he saw the chains piercing the ground where he had stood, and the crater that formed when Hammer punched that same spot a moment later. Both of those skills were rather unique, and informed him of who he was facing. "Kushina Uzumaki," he intoned, his voice shifting into its normal flat inflection. "I was told that you were dead." "And Tsunade Senju," he added, turning his gaze to Hammer. "Interesting." The chains withdrew from the ground and returned to Kushina, where they waved menacingly in the air. Tsunade straightened and cracked her knuckles before saying, "We've been hoping to meet you for years," she said. "And why is that?" he asked curiously. Kusha had warned him they would react negatively to his presence, but the Bija had neglected to fully explain why. "You tried to kill my son," Kushina snarled, "so now I'm going to kill you." Her hands tightened on the nodachi she wielded, and he could see her chakra flaring wildly as she prepared to move. It only took him a moment more to connect the dots and understand what was going on. When he next met Kushu, they would be having words about the Bija's rather short-sighted plan. He did not relish the thought of two S-class shinobi with a personal vendetta against him, especially for something he had only technically done. Chapter 40, Unwelcome Reunions, Part 4, August 2nd, 347 NE, miles outside of Konoha. The Tomo in Itachi's eyes were spinning rapidly as he pushed them to their limit, his Sharingan processing every minute twitch and flare of chakra from his opponents. Kushina form shimmered as the chains, projections of solid chakra, a feat Itachi had never seen performed by anyone other than Kushu, who used his Yuki to do so, retracted from the ground. Her body reabsorbed the chakra as she did so, the transition from solid structure to formless energy happening swiftly and efficiently. Itachi could see the chakra she was pushing into her muscles was focused on her legs, back, and arms. She would be charging forward in a moment, prepared to swing her nodachi at any of several angles. Tsunade was slowly straightening from her crouch, the chakra in her body evenly distributed and appearing to be only slightly elevated in concentration. The telltale flares were much smaller, but she would be charging forward slightly after Kushina moved, and their paths would intersect. There, Itachi moved, simultaneously flinging 8 kunai, 4 from each hand, and layering a triggered genjutsu over the spot both Kushina and Tsunade would be crossing. Kushina swiped her sword through the air, and a thick wave of air knocked all of the kunai aside. She stumbled for a moment as she triggered the genjutsu, and found her perception of reality randomly skewed, the ground beneath her feet pitching back and forth while the air slammed against her skin as if she had just rammed into a steel wall. Tsunade entered the genjutsu a moment later, but it washed over her like she wasn't even there, her chakra expelling the foreign influence the moment it entered her system. A tap from a single finger on Kushina's shoulder broke the genjutsu a moment later, and Kushina recovered and was moving at top speed a breath after that. Itachi nodded slightly as he leapt backwards and used a ninjutsu that caused the ground where he had been standing and for 20 meters in every direction to turn into quicksand. Kushina moved left, avoiding the trap while slicing the air with her sword. The wave of wind was razor-sharp and would likely cut him in two if it connected. Tsunade chose to leap into the air, the arc of her descent placing her roughly 2 meters from his current position. She would be his target. Itachi rolled forwards, allowing Kushina's wave of air to pass overhead. When he came up, his right forefinger and thumb were forming a circle around his mouth. He exhaled sharply, and the air between him and Tsunade rippled slightly before igniting into a firestorm. The technique would hardly defeat someone of her caliber, but it would obscure his next actions. Kushina was coming around the edge of the quicksand, her sword already poised for the next swing. His next exhalation ignited the air between them as well, and then he created 3 clones, 1 standard illusion clone, 1 earth clone, and 1 shadow clone. The clones scattered, the illusion moving towards Kushina, the earth clone towards Tsunade, and the shadow clone retreating. Itachi himself dove forward into the quicksand, submerging without so much as a ripple. Once he was concealed within the chakra-laced terrain, he created 4 more shadow clones which began to quickly make their way back towards where he had left the Konoha ninja. A loud crack sounded in the air before the firestorm exploded away from a central point. The shadow clone noted that Tsunade's fist was currently extended and there was an unusually high concentration of chakra in the air around her hand, and concluded that she had created a shockwave of some sort, likely using her infamous strength technique. Kushina's approach was rather different, as the firestorm spiraled around her sword before she thrust it forward and unleashed the captured flames as a torrent of fire that managed to engulf both the illusion before her and the earth clone near Tsunade. The illusion was destroyed immediately, but the earth clone weathered the technique and launched itself at Tsunade. She shattered it a moment later with a single punch, the clone nearly exploding with the force of her blow. Kushina was already charging towards the retreating shadow clone, but Tsunade paused, her stance wary. The shadow clone continued to draw Kushina away, using its active Sharingan to dodge the repeated strikes from the enraged Kunoichi. The real Itachi, sensing that his opponents were separating, emerged from underground to launch his own attack against Tsunade. Dozens of earthen spikes thrust upwards, forcing Tsunade to retreat into the air where she was met by a roaring dragon of fire. Her fist lashed out again, but rather than destroying the fire as she had the first time, her blow tore it in half, each half forming into an independent dragon that turned to pursue her as she began her descent to the ground. The shadow clone, seeing that Tsunade was occupied for the moment, began casting Genjutsu after Genjutsu at Kushina, hoping to snare her deeply and take her out of the battle. The kunoichi seemed prepared for that tactic this time, quick pulses of chakra dispelling the illusions before they could take root. But the fourth one took longer to dispel, and the fifth was not dispelled at all. Her chakra began to fluctuate wildly as the Genjutsu pulled out her deepest fears and assaulted her consciousness. Her movements became hesitant as her mind tried to reconcile what it knew to be her current situation with the images it was being fed. The shadow clone's eyes narrowed as it noted an odd pattern of chakra within the woman's body, the concentration beginning on the surface of her skin and rippling inwards, then forming on her skin once again. After several more repetitions, the chakra exploded outwards forcefully as Kushina let out a harsh yell. Even with the Sharingan's warning, the chains moved much faster than they had before, and the shadow clone was unable to dodge completely as literally hundreds of chains lanced outward in all directions. The clone was struck by no less than 4. On his real body the damage would have been relatively minor, but it was enough to dispel the clone. Itachi's eyes widened as he received the memories from his clone. It would appear that Kushina's weakness to Genjutsu was real, but also a double-edged sword. She seemed to enter an almost berserk state rather than succumbing to unconsciousness or catatonia. She was not entirely unaware of the battlefield, however, as none of the chains came close to threatening Tsunade. The initial speed of this version of her chain attack was also much more dangerous, and even if the clone had survived it would have found itself surrounded on all sides. The fact that Kushina did not use that technique for her first attack implied that there was a cost or drawback that was not immediately apparent, however, and that its use now was born of desperation or rage rather than cunning. The cost of using so many projections must be high, but he could see her beginning to retract the chains already. He returned his focus to his near opponent, as Tsunade had managed to effectively counter the fire dragons with an earth dragon of her own, the larger construct methodically snuffing out his own burning creations. Itachi was preparing his next attack when he saw a large section of the dragon breaking off and approaching his position at high speed. The tightly controlled surge of chakra he felt just prior to that was something he was learning to associate with Tsunade's infamous strength technique. Rather than dodging, he dove forward and through the chunk of earth, his skill with the earth style mold technique stretched to its limit as he compensated for the rotation of the rock and its movement relative to his own body. He emerged out of the other side a moment later, coming face to face with Tsunade. Even masked and cloaked as she was, her shock at his unexpected maneuver was clear. That did not mean her reactions were slow, however, and already her right fist was jabbing forward and her chakra flaring in preparation for a devastating blow. Itachi turned sideways, letting the fist slide past him. As Tsunade began to react to his dodge, his left hand grabbed her wrist and pulled her arm outwards. The rest of her body followed the pull and she began applying pressure against him, but his pull suddenly changed to a push and his other hand came up to grip her elbow. A sharp twist later, still following her own body's attempts to resist the initial grab, and Tsunade was spinning through the air. He released his grip at that point, as Tsunade was already adjusting to his attack, and instead used the opportunity provided by her body's motion to rip the mask from her head and expose her eyes. Frustratingly, but unsurprisingly, her eyes snapped shut faster than he could lock gazes with her and used the Sharingan to implant a Genjutsu directly. Tsunade somehow managed to get her feet under her, avoiding what would have been a painful landing on her back, and was soon upright. Itachi quickly moved backwards, avoiding Tsunade's response as chakra rippled down her legs and completely shattered the earth all around her, the ground fracturing and splitting open. She opened her eyes at that point, but she kept her gaze low and still did not meet his gaze directly. The grimace on her face showed her frustration at losing her protection from his Sharingan. A quick glance at the interior of the mask showed Itachi that it was roughly equivalent to ANBU standard issue, and thus had no unique value to him, so he simply destroyed it to prevent Tsunade from somehow recovering it. "Fucking Uchiha," she growled under her breath, her hands clenching as she tried to decide her next move. Behind her, Itachi could see that Kushina was rapidly reabsorbing the swarm of chains she had unleashed and turning in his direction. He had performed acceptably thus far, but he had expended far more chakra than either of his opponents, and would not be able to continue doing so indefinitely. Whether through inclination or strategy, Both Tsunade and Kushina seemed to be reserving the majority of their chakra for physical enhancement and highly efficient techniques. In Kushina's case, while it was unclear just how much chakra each individual chain used, it was obvious that she was well practiced with reabsorbing them. Even with the advantage of the Sharingan, he would not fare well in prolonged close combat with either of his opponents singly, and he would undoubtedly lose attempting to face both at once. Fortunately, the time for combat had passed. Uchiha Itachi. In the name of the third Hokage of Konoha, you are hereby under arrest. Came the sudden cry as 8 Konoha ninjas sprang into the clearing and surrounded the combatants, weapons drawn and expressions fierce. TCH, Tsunade spat, frowning harshly. Looks like you might survive for a little while after all. Indeed, Itachi said, nodding thoughtfully. Our meeting has proved most illuminating. I hope you understand when I say I hope we do not meet again soon. Tsunade's eyes narrowed even as Kushina settled into a ready stance a few meters away from her, Nodachi held before her with the tip pointing straight at Itachi's heart. You intend to resist? The leader of the Konoha ninja exclaimed. So be it. Attack! With that command, all 8 of the ninja began launching kunai and jutsu at Tsunade and Kushina. You son of a bitch! Tsunade yelled as she began frantically dodging the combined attacks of the ninja around her. Kushina said nothing and attempted to charge Itachi, only to be intercepted by 4 Konoha ninja. For a moment it seemed that she might simply cut her way through them to reach Itachi, but she abruptly turned away with a loud curse and began focusing on fighting her opponents without killing them. Itachi wasted no more time, pushing his reinforced muscles to the limits as he fled the clearing and sought to put as much ground between himself and the 2 vengeance-minded kunoichi as possible. With his clones manipulating the real Konoha ninja via Genjutsu and supporting them in their efforts, he was confident Tsunade and Kushina would be delayed long enough for him to make his escape. Konoha. All across Konoha, seemingly innocuous groups of crates, wooden plaques, and even chairs and benches had been carefully moved about and rearranged before and during the chaos that had briefly engulfed Konoha. The numerous teams of ninja sweeping the village for threats paid them no mind. The few capable of recognizing the carefully disguised symbols formed by the new orientation of these everyday items occupied elsewhere with other tasks. Even the Hyuga with their vaunted bloodline did not immediately recognize the chakra stored within the objects as a threat, as many objects throughout Konoha utilized chakra for many different purposes. Not all of them had been properly assembled, and not all of them had been properly activated, but many had. And, as the timing arrays on each activated and triggered the rest of the ceiling array, not all of them exploded with great force, but many did. Shinobi District. Before we get to that, does your arm not need to be tended to? The Hokage said slowly, his expression looking for all the world like he was sincerely concerned. Kushu could see the calculating gleam in the Hokage's eyes though, and knew that the old man was wondering just how debilitating such an injury was to him, and how easily he was able to recover from it. Apparently not, Kushu replied nonchalantly as he began to walk over to Gaara. I was kinda worried at first, but then my special chakra kicked in and I could use it just like it was my own arm. I can already feel the damaged flesh regenerating, though I can't say how quickly it will heal just yet. I see, the Hokage said. Very well then, I will trust your judgment on the matter for now. He cleared his throat roughly before turning to Dragon. I believe the situation here is well in hand. Please return to scouting the village and taking care of any other threats. Kakashi may remain, as his student is involved. Thank you, Hokage-sama, Kakashi replied as Dragon and the other ninja saluted and leapt away. As for your question, Naruto-kun, that was not truly the 4th Hokage. It was merely a construct with his likeness and abilities, but none of his personality or knowledge. Really, Kusha said slowly as he began healing Gaara's injury. The red-headed genin had yet to make a single sound of pain or protest, instead merely panting lightly in exhaustion, and he simply nodded in response to Kusha's ministrations. The damage to his shoulder was mostly superficial and was easily corrected. With that taken care of, Kusha pulled out some bandages and began wrapping the missing section of his arm to conceal the true extent of the injury. No need to flaunt the use of his yuki, after all. And how does that work? There is a forbidden jutsu known as the Impure World Resurrection. I will not go into specifics, but it was first developed by our second Hokage during the First War. It allows the user of the jutsu to control the ninja resurrected remotely, although the range involved in this attack seems to be much greater than what I had believed possible. Kusha froze, his thoughts rapidly reviewing the Yandame's actions during their encounter. Meaning that everything the fake 4th Hokage said or did was actually this other ninja. Essentially correct, yes. That was not good. He hadn't revealed everything, far from it, but this other ninja now had a more accurate picture of his abilities, and much worse, his limitations, than anyone else alive. Whoever this ninja is figured out my condition based on my usage of the special chakra, Kusha said, staring at the Hokage intently. Do we know who he is, or better yet know where he is? The Hokage just sighed. We know who, but not where. The exact details will remain privileged for the time being until Konoha has a chance to formulate our response. It's not something a genin, or even a chunin, needs to know at the moment. Kusha nodded in acceptance, understanding the implicit later in the Hokage's words. Further conversation was interrupted as a series of explosions began to ripple across Konoha, striking seemingly at random all over the village. Kami, what is it now? The Hokage growled. Kakashi, get them to emergency shelter 12, then report to Shikaku immediately. Understood, Hokage-sama. Kakashi said quickly. Kushu did not resist as Kakashi grabbed both him and Gaara and pulled them into a shunshin. Kakashi pushed them into the shelter roughly a minute later and left quickly, though not before threatening to have yet another long talk about risk assessment, and not charging headlong into battle. Kankuro and Temari immediately swooped down on Gaara, pestering him about his already healed injury while shooting slight glares at Hinata for some reason. Hinata was staring at him intensely with a nearly blank expression on her face, but his attention was soon pulled to Ino, who had walked over and was standing in front of him. She looked him over critically for a long moment, her eyes lingering on the bandages on his right arm, before she nodded slightly. Then she punched him in the gut. He folded slightly with the blow, expelling the breath from his lungs, before slowly straightening and eyeing Ino curiously. And what was that for? He asked. For being an idiot, of course, she replied airily, before turning around to face Hinata. See? I told you he would be fine. Kusha turned to face Hinata, but her expression didn't change in spite of Ino's comment. Then he felt something pressing against the bandages wrapped around his missing elbow, and looked down to see Hinata's younger sister, Hanabi, poking him with a curious expression on her face. Nechan said your arm got cut off, she said innocently. Did you stick it back on? Kusha snorted, amused at how accurate her childish summation of events actually was. Something like that, he said, patting her on the head. Hanabi, quit bothering Naruto-san, Hayashi said, motioning his daughter over to him. She huffed indignantly but followed her father's command. Kusha turned to scan the rest of the shelter, noting that his Anna, Hayashi's wife, was present along with a handful of branch house Hyuga. Sasuke and his team was present as well, along with 2 female Uchiha that he recognized as the other targeted children. None of the members of Team Mikoto were present, as they had been assigned to a different shelter. Why? Hinata asked suddenly. Kusha replied curiously. Why don't you care about yourself? I'd heard bits and pieces over the years, and I knew that Kakashi kept talking to you about being careful, but I didn't really understand until today. Earlier, you got hit by that lightning attack and were hurt so badly, but you acted like nothing had happened. And now your arm. It's like it doesn't matter to you. Hinata's voice was soft and low, but it carried throughout the shelter as an uneasy silence fell upon the assembled group. Kushu didn't respond immediately, instead staring at the girl silently as he considered his answer. A flippant reply would not satisfy her, that much was obvious, and her question had clearly sparked interest among the others in the shelter. Even Hanabi appeared to be listening raptly for his response, though he doubted she understood just what her sister was talking about. One day, when I was 3.5 years old, he began, I was leaving the library after checking out a few books. He chuckled internally as he heard Hayashi inhale sharply, and half expected the man to stop him from continuing. The Hyuga clan had said nothing, however, and so he continued. Once I was outside, a nice, friendly man approached me and offered to help me carry my books. We walked a few blocks, happily chatting about what I was reading, and then we turned a corner, and he stabbed me in the heart. There were the expected gasps and shocked protestations from Hinata and the other genin in the room, and he turned silently to look at Hayashi. The clan head grimaced, but nodded. I saw the medical reports, the man told the others. That did happen. Kushu nodded to him, then turned his attention back to Hinata. Her eyes were watering and her hands were covering her mouth as she stared at him, horrified. It was after that event that I was moved to the Yamanaka household and met Ino Nechan. I'm sure you remember the incident that happened shortly after that. All of the adults and the clan kids who had been present nodded, though Sakura and the Tsunade genin looked on in confusion. By all rights, I should have been dead before my 4th birthday. Twice over, in fact, and yet here I am. So while I may seem uncaring about personal injury, I have very good reason. I have suffered worse than this and faced death many times before now. Death does not scare me. Hinata was openly crying now, looking like she wished she had never asked her question in the first place. Even Ino looked a bit misty-eyed, though he suspected that was for rather different reasons. What does scare me is a threat to my family. If significant personal injury is what it takes to keep them safe, then I will not hesitate to act, he concluded, his voice earnest and with one hand, not so coincidentally his recently detached right hand, raised in a clenched fist in front of him. He was pleased to note the odd and respectful expressions from the other ninja in the room, even Hayashi looking impressed with his impromptu speech. Then Hinata lunged forward and latched onto him, still crying, and some of the other kids apparently took that as a signal to start a group hug. Sakura darted over and clamped her arms around both him and Hinata. Then Hizana and Hanabi got into the act. Ino and Temari had gotten mixed in somehow as well, while the other adult ninja and genin, both Konoha and Suna, looked on with varying expressions ranging from sympathetic to amused to jealous. Kushu suffered through the sudden embrace gracefully as he savored the irony of using the psychological knowledge and acting skills acquired through his time in Konoha to deceive the ninja of that same village. And, like all the best lies, it was all both perfectly true and perfectly misleading. 2:00 p.m. Hokage's office. Sarutobi rubbed his hands over his face tiredly before turning to look at the other ninja assembled in his office. Shikaka had a seat that was positioned to the side of the Hokage's desk, while Dragon, Shizen, and Jiraiya stood in front of the desk. Shizen, we'll start with you, the Hokage said. Yes, Hokage-sama. On the ninja side, the latest reports indicate that we have lost 3 ANBU, 2 Jounin, 12 Tokubetsu Jounin, and 8 Chunin. No genin casualties have been reported thus far. On the civilian side, we lost nearly 300 when the resurrected Nidaime attacked the stadium, and we are still trying to get a tally of losses from the rest of the village. Initial estimates put the total civilian loss at roughly 400 with over 1,000 injured. The Hokage nodded, and turned to Jiraiya. What of the Fire Lord and the other nobles? Jiraiya snorted. The Fire Lord complimented us on our swift response to the threat, and said that he was pleased that we had protected him and his family so well. We couldn't even hear anything from within the shelter, and he and the other nobles spent the whole time acting like they were at some court function, he added, sounding disgusted. The Fire Lord did vow to support us as we recover from this heinous and cowardly attack though, which I translate to a lot of pompous speeches and maybe a little money. The other dignitaries who were with us echoed his sentiments. Shikaka nodded. That would be normal for him, but it should give the other villages pause and give us a little time to get things straightened out internally. The Hokage nodded in agreement, then turned to Dragon. Initial reports, the ANBU commander began, placed the enemy assailants into 3 categories. The first, those involved in the primary attack consisting of the resurrected Hokages and their summoner, Orochimaru. Our current assumption is that he is responsible for the modified explosive tags planted throughout Konoha as well. The second, the bandits and thieves we believe to be loosely associated with, or possibly directly employed by, the Eastern Dragons. And the third, other ninja who entered the village seeking to take advantage of the chaos. For the first group, we have found evidence that Orochimaru was supported by ninja outside the village, but we have not captured or identified anyone who may be involved. The only positive link we have is the fact that Jirobo, one of the sound genin, was manipulated by some unknown technique that resembles the impure world resurrection in function. We have found no sign of his 2 teammates. For the second group, we have captured 14, 3 of which we believe held positions of leadership, and 2 of which appear to have had limited ninja training. We also killed 117 of them, with an additional 5 deaths due to accidents or friendly fire. This group caused significant structural damage throughout the Shinobi district through the use of exploding tags, apparently with the aim of looting any ninja scrolls or equipment they could get their hands on. All of the affected clans and ninja are performing an inventory as we speak, but the Yamanaka, Akimichi, Aburame, Nara, and Inuzuka have reported that their compounds were not significantly breached during the assault. The Hyuga compound was protected by the branch house members assigned to guard it, and suffered no damage. We do not have reports from all of the Uchiha clan yet, but there are indications that at least some of the Uchiha residences, particularly apartments, were successfully breached. Dragon paused, sighing. I also have a report from the records department that indicates that the secure archives were breached and a significant portion of the scrolls within were taken, including the scroll of forbidden seals. What? The Hokage hissed. How did that happen? We are still trying to determine that, Hokage-sama. But it appears that 2 assailants infiltrated the building and assassinated the guards within. From what we can tell, they made it most of the way to their goal before anyone noticed them, at which point they eliminated the rest of the Konoha ninja and destroyed the barrier protecting the secure archives. It would take more than exploding tags to get through that thing, Jiraiya pointed out, his face grim. Both Minato and I added our own protections to it over the years. I agree, Jiraiya-sama, Dragon replied. Nonetheless, the barrier was down, and the anchor seals cracked beyond repair when we arrived. The anchor seals were cracked? Jiraiya stressed, looking thoughtful. That means they added a seal that created a feedback loop and overloaded the whole thing. Not that hard to do, normally, but I know that barrier had a ridiculous number of buffers and vents to prevent exactly that sort of attack. Which means, an inside job, Shikaku concluded grimly. Someone had to have time to study the barrier extensively, and figure out exactly how and where to break it, as well as account for routine adjustments made over the years. Dragon nodded. That was our conclusion as well, given how easily the enemy infiltrated the building. It's a little worse than that, Jiraiya pointed out. They'd have to have time to study the barrier, sure, but they also have to have enough skill to know where to place the new seals to keep the whole thing from blowing up in their face. So we're dealing with someone who has, at minimum, a solid foundation in Fuinjutsu, the patience to infiltrate Konoha to study the seal, and a willingness to do anything to acquire forbidden jutsu. Sound familiar? Orochimaru, the Hokage snarled. So that was his goal. Do we have any other information regarding the Forbidden Scroll Dragon? Nothing for certain yet, Hokage-sama. However, there may be a connection with someone in the third group that we haven't uncovered yet. Very well, tell me about the third group then. A small number of skilled missing nin were found within Konoha once Orochimaru began his attack. So far we only know the exact mission of one of them, the A-rank missing nin from Kyuubi who attempted to assassinate Gaara and who was in turn killed by Team Kakashi and Team Baki in a coordinated counterattack. We captured 3 other missing nin, 2 B-rank and 1 A-rank, and have turned them over to Ibiki-san for interrogation. 5 others were killed when they resisted capture, 4 more B-rank and 1 A-rank. Dragon paused and cleared his throat roughly before he continued. We also have a report from Team Haruo, who were sweeping outside of Konoha during the attack. According to the report, they stumbled across 3 S-rank ninja, one of whom was disguised as a Konoha nin. 2 of them were dressed in ANBU-style uniforms, though without any visible markings of village affiliation, and have been positively identified as the independent contractors known as Sword and Hammer. They were also in possession of a valid Konoha passcode that identified them as friendlies, and gave the code upon request. Jiraiya spoke up at this point. I have contact with them on occasion, and they were in fact responsible for providing some of my intelligence prior to the Chunin exams. They got the code from me. Thank you, Jiraiya-sama, for clearing that up. Who was the other ninja, the one disguised as a Konoha nin? The Hokage asked. Itachi Uchiha, Dragon said uncomfortably. Despite the Hokage's reassurances, Dragon still felt responsible for recommending the young man for ANBU and failing to prevent his eventual defection. What was he doing? The Hokage asked, his voice insistent. The Hokage's expression was grave, and Jiraiya mirrored it. Shizen looked pensive, but Shikaku seemed oddly thoughtful as he listened to the report. Team Haruo had very limited interaction with him, but from the small bit they overheard of his discussion with Sword and Hammer, he had apparently just killed an unidentified ninja. When they discovered his deception, he hit them with the Genjutsu and fled. Sword and Hammer broke the Genjutsu first and pursued him by themselves, but were ultimately unsuccessful in capturing or defeating him. Itachi also used Genjutsu to manipulate Team Haruo into attacking Sword and Hammer in the mistaken belief that they were Itachi. Team Haruo suffered serious but non-life-threatening injuries during the brief battle that ensued, and report that Sword and Hammer provided basic treatment before retreating. Have you had any success in tracing Itachi's movements? The Hokage asked. No, Hokage-sama, Dragon replied succinctly. The first and only positive sighting occurs well outside of the village, and it does not appear that Sword and Hammer knew who they were talking to at first. Team Haruo only made the positive identification after they observed his activated Sharingan. Shikaku spoke up next. Itachi served under you for several years, Dragon. In your opinion, why would he risk returning to Konoha? I cannot say for certain, Shikaku-sama, but in my experience Itachi weighs and measures his every action against his ultimate goal. Whatever that may have been in this case, I see no reason to assume that he did not succeed in achieving what he set out to do.